The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, is a date that will forever live in infamy. But what happened after the smoke cleared? What happened when America woke up the next morning and realized it was at war with three of the most powerful military machines on Earth: Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy? The government looked at the numbers, and what they saw terrified them. Here was the problem. America needed to build the most powerful military force the world had ever seen, and it needed to do it fast. Really fast. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, more than 1 million American men volunteered for military service. By the end of 1942, over 3 million were in uniform. By war's end, that number would reach 16 million. 16 million men. Gone. Vanished from factories, farms, shipyards, and construction sites across the nation. But here's the terrifying part. Those men who left to fight, they needed weapons. Lots of weapons. They needed aircraft, tens of thousands of fighters and bombers. They needed ships, battleships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, transport vessels. They needed tanks, jeeps, trucks, rifles, machine guns, artillery pieces, ammunition by the billions of rounds. They needed uniforms, boots, helmets, food rations, medical supplies. The list went on and on. Someone had to build all of that. And not just build it faster than any nation had ever manufactured anything before. Because America wasn't just equipping its own forces. Under the Lend-Lease Act, the United States was supplying weapons and equipment to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and dozens of other allied nations fighting the Axis powers. America had to become what President Franklin Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. But who was going to do the work? In 1939, unemployment had stood at 17.2%. The Great Depression had been brutal. Millions of Americans couldn't find work. But by 1942, just the first full year of American mobilization, unemployment had plummeted to 4.7%. By 1944, it had reached 1.2%, the lowest rate of the entire 20th century. There weren't just enough workers. There weren't nearly enough workers. The United States government faced a crisis that threatened to undermine the entire war effort before it even began. Defense contractors were screaming for workers. Aircraft plants needed tens of thousands of skilled riveters, welders, and assemblers. Shipyards needed crane operators, electricians, pipefitters. Munitions plants needed precision workers to assemble bombs and artillery shells. But the young men who had traditionally filled these jobs were gone, shipped overseas to fight. In March 1941, before America even entered the war, more than 1.2 million women between the ages of 20 and 24 had registered for war work. But that was just the beginning. The government knew it needed millions more. Enter the War Manpower Commission. Established in April 1942, this federal agency had one overwhelming task: recruit enough workers to keep America's defense industries running at maximum capacity. And the commission came to a conclusion that, at the time, seemed almost unthinkable to many Americans. The only untapped labor pool large enough to meet the crisis was women. Not just young, single women. Married women. Mothers. Women who had never worked outside the home. Women who society had always told should stay home, raise children, and leave the working world to men. This wasn't just about filling a few secretarial positions. This was about fundamentally transforming American society. Before the war, only about 1% of women worked in manufacturing. Those women who did work outside the home were typically employed as teachers, nurses, or secretaries, jobs considered appropriate for women. The idea of women working in heavy industry, operating dangerous machinery, welding steel, building aircraft and ships, that was considered men's work. Impossible work for women. Too dangerous. Too physically demanding. Too complicated. Women simply weren't capable of it, or so conventional wisdom insisted. But the War Manpower Commission didn't have the luxury of conventional wisdom. The commission had production quotas and impossible deadlines. Aircraft manufacturers had promised to deliver thousands of bombers and fighters. Shipyards had committed to building hundreds of vessels. If those promises weren't kept, American soldiers would go into battle without adequate equipment, and the war could be lost. It was that simple and that terrifying. So the commission launched what would become one of the most intensive recruitment campaigns in American history. The target? Women. 6 million women, to be exact. That was the goal, to bring 6 million American women who had never worked outside the home into the industrial workforce. 6 million housewives, mothers, and daughters who would need to be convinced that they could do jobs traditionally held by men. 6 million women who would need training in skills they'd never imagined learning. 6 million women who would help build the military machine that would win World War II. But convincing 6 million women to take factory jobs was easier said than done. The commission faced resistance from multiple directions. Many men, including factory managers, union leaders, and even government officials, believed women simply couldn't handle industrial work. These men worried that hiring women would slow production, cause accidents, and lower the quality of manufactured goods. Some union leaders feared that women workers would accept lower wages and undercut men's pay rates. Even more surprising, many women themselves were hesitant. Middle-class and upper-middle-class women had been raised with the belief that working outside the home, especially in a factory, was beneath their social station. Many married women worried about what their husbands, families, and neighbors would think. Who would take care of the children? Who would cook, clean, and maintain the household? What would people say about a woman who abandoned her domestic responsibilities to work in a factory alongside men? The cultural obstacles were enormous. For generations, American society had constructed rigid gender roles. Men were breadwinners. Women were homemakers. Men worked outside the home. Women worked inside it. Men were strong and capable with machinery. Women were delicate and suited to nurturing roles. These weren't just ideas, they were deeply ingrained cultural beliefs that shaped how Americans understood themselves and their world. The War Manpower Commission understood that simply posting help-wanted signs wouldn't work. The commission needed to change hearts and minds. It needed to make factory work patriotic, respectable, even glamorous. It needed to convince women that taking a factory job wasn't abandoning their femininity or their families. It was the highest form of patriotic service. It was their way of fighting the war, of protecting their husbands and sons overseas, of defending American freedom. And so began one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns of the 20th century. The government partnered with advertising agencies, Hollywood studios, magazine publishers, and artists to create a flood of images and messages aimed directly at American women. Posters appeared in post offices, train stations, and store windows. Magazine advertisements urged women to take war jobs. Radio programs featured dramatic stories of women factory workers. Hollywood movies showed glamorous actresses working on production lines. Newsreels in movie theaters celebrated women's contributions to the war effort. The message was everywhere, and it was carefully crafted. Yes, factory work was hard. Yes, it required learning new skills. But it was also exciting, meaningful, and essential. Women weren't being asked to give up their femininity. They were being asked to use their natural abilities to help win the war. The dexterity that made women good at sewing and knitting, perfect for the precision work required in aircraft assembly. The patience that made women good mothers, ideal for the detailed, repetitive work of munitions manufacturing. The determination and resilience women showed in managing households, exactly what was needed on the factory floor. Two images, in particular, would become iconic symbols of this campaign. The first was Norman Rockwell's Rosie the Riveter, which appeared on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in May 1943. Rockwell's Rosie was muscular, confident, and competent, A woman taking a lunch break from her welding work, a rivet gun resting across her lap, her foot casually planted on a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. She was powerful, patriotic, and unmistakably feminine all at once. The second image was even more famous, a poster created by artist J. Howard Miller for the Westinghouse Electric Corporation. It showed a woman in a red polka dot bandana, flexing her arm to show her bicep, with the caption, "We can do it." The image projected strength, determination, and confidence. This wasn't a delicate flower who needed protection. This was a woman who could do the job, who could handle the work, who could help win the war. These images worked. They worked because they tapped into something real, something that had always been there, but that American society had chosen to ignore. Women were capable. Women were strong. Women could learn complex skills and perform demanding physical labor. All they needed was the opportunity to prove it. And World War II was about to give them that opportunity. By late 1942, the trickle of women entering defense industries was becoming a flood. Women were lining up at employment offices. They were enrolling in government-sponsored training programs. They were showing up at factory gates, ready to work. The labor shortage crisis that had threatened to cripple America's war effort was beginning to ease. Not because the government had found millions of unemployed men, but because millions of American women had answered the call. These women came from every background imaginable. Some were young and single, eager for adventure and economic independence. Others were married women whose husbands were overseas fighting. Still others were widows or single mothers struggling to support their families. Some were middle-class housewives who had never worked for pay in their lives. Others had worked in low-wage service jobs, as domestic servants, waitresses, or farm laborers, and saw factory work as a chance for better pay and better working conditions. African American women, in particular, saw the war as an opportunity to escape the crushing limitations of domestic service. Before the war, nearly 60% of employed Black women worked as domestic servants, cooking, cleaning, and caring for white families' homes and children for poverty wages. But defense industry jobs paid 3 or 4 times as much. These jobs offered a chance at economic security, at dignity, at a better future. Black women applied for these jobs by the thousands, even though they knew they would face discrimination, harassment, and segregation once they got hired. The question facing America in 1942 wasn't whether women could do factory work. The propaganda had done its job. Millions of women were ready and willing to try. The real question was whether American industry was ready for them. Were factories prepared to provide separate restrooms and changing areas? Would male supervisors and coworkers accept women on the shop floor? Could training programs really teach housewives to operate complex machinery in a matter of weeks? And here's the thing that nobody knew for sure in those early months of 1942. Could women actually do the work? Not just some women, exceptional women, but millions of ordinary women from ordinary backgrounds? Could they learn to rivet aircraft fuselages? Could they operate massive cranes in shipyards? Could they weld steel and assemble engines and build tanks? The War Manpower Commission was betting the entire war effort that the answer was yes. Defense contractors were reluctantly agreeing to hire women because they had no other choice. And millions of American women were about to walk into factories across the nation and find out if they could really do what the posters said they could do. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, about 12 million American women worked outside the home. By 1945, that number had increased to more than 18.5 million, an increase of 6.6 million women workers in just 4 years. It was one of the most dramatic social transformations in American history, compressed into the span of a single war. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Behind those statistics were individual women making individual decisions, decisions that would change their lives, change their families, and ultimately change America. These women were about to discover capabilities they never knew they had. They were about to prove that the limitations society had placed on them were artificial and unnecessary. They were about to build the weapons that would win the greatest war in human history. This is the story of why 6 million American women joined epic factories to win World War II. This is the story of how a national crisis shattered gender barriers that had stood for generations. This is the story of how ordinary women did extraordinary things and, in the process, changed the world. The labor shortage emergency of 1942 was real. The solution, recruiting millions of women into heavy industry, was unprecedented. What happened next would surprise everyone, including the women themselves. Why did they do it? Why did millions of American women leave the safety and familiarity of their homes to take jobs in factories, shipyards, and munitions plants? Why did they agree to learn skills they'd never imagined needing, to work alongside strangers, to face danger and exhaustion day after day? The answer wasn't simple. It was never just one thing. But for many women, the most powerful motivation was something deeper than money or adventure. It was patriotism. Pure, unshakable, fierce patriotism. Picture this. It's early 1943. A woman, let's call her Mary, sits at her kitchen table reading a letter from her husband. He's somewhere in North Africa with the 1st Infantry Division, though the Army censors won't let him say exactly where. His letters are cheerful, trying to reassure her that he's safe, that everything will be fine. But Mary knows better. She reads the newspapers. She listens to the radio. She knows American soldiers are dying by the thousands fighting the Germans in Tunisia. Mary looks around her kitchen. Everything is exactly as her husband left it 6 months ago when he shipped out. His favorite chair, his reading glasses on the side table, the framed photograph of their wedding day. The house feels empty without him. Too quiet, too still. And Mary feels helpless. Her husband is risking his life on the other side of the world, and what is she doing? Cooking meals for one, keeping house for nobody, waiting, just waiting. Then one day, Mary sees a poster at the post office. A woman in coveralls and a bandana, sleeves rolled up, flexing her arm. The caption reads, "We can do it," and suddenly, Mary realizes something. She doesn't have to just wait. She doesn't have to be helpless. There's something she can do to help win this war. She can take a job in a defense plant. She can build the airplanes and tanks and ships that will protect her husband and bring him home safely. This wasn't hypothetical. This was real. This was the decision thousands of women made every single day between 1942 and 1945. Letters and diaries from the period reveal the depth of these women's patriotic feelings. One woman wrote to a friend explaining her decision to take a factory job this way. "If I can't fight alongside my husband, at least I can build the weapons he needs to fight. That's my way of being in this war too." Another woman, working in a welding plant in England, but expressing sentiments identical to American women, wrote about her determination to master welding despite serious eye problems. When doctors told her the eye strain from welding was damaging her vision, she demanded to be allowed to continue anyway. She wrote to a friend, "Tell your father to demand my presence in the welding, will you please?" Her commitment to the war effort overrode her concern for her own health. This pattern repeated itself millions of times across America. Women didn't take factory jobs because they wanted to. Most of them didn't dream of working in a noisy, dangerous industrial plant. They did it because they believed it was their duty. They did it because their country needed them. They did it because their husbands, sons, brothers, and fathers were fighting overseas, and this was their way of fighting too. The government understood this motivation and exploited it brilliantly. Propaganda posters didn't just promise good wages or exciting work. They appealed directly to women's sense of patriotic duty. One famous poster showed a woman looking longingly at a photograph of a soldier in uniform, presumably her husband or boyfriend. The caption read, "Longing won't bring him back sooner. Get a war job." The message was clear. If you love someone fighting overseas, the best thing you can do for him is to help build the weapons he needs to win and come home. Another poster showed a female typist with the caption, "Victory waits on your fingers. Keep M flying, Miss USA." Even clerical work, typing, filing, answering phones, was portrayed as essential war work. Women who worked in offices freed up men to fight. Women who worked in factories built the tools of victory. Either way, women's work directly contributed to defeating the Axis powers. The propaganda worked because it tapped into something genuine. American women in the 1940s had been raised with strong patriotic values. They'd grown up saluting the flag in school, singing the national anthem, believing that America was the greatest nation on earth. When their country called on them to serve, they answered. It was that straightforward for many women. But patriotism didn't just mean taking a factory job. It meant accepting the entire transformation that came with war work. It meant learning new skills. It meant adapting to a masculine work environment. It meant dealing with supervisors and coworkers who didn't want women in the factory. It meant enduring physical exhaustion, workplace dangers, and social criticism from people who thought women belonged at home. Consider the letters written by women who worked in war factories. These letters reveal the challenges women faced and their determination to overcome them. One woman wrote about standing idle in a factory, desperate for work, while male supervisors ignored her. She wrote, "I didn't know it was such hard work doing nothing." She wanted to work. She wanted to contribute. But she was forced to stand in the corner because management didn't know what to do with female workers. Despite these frustrations, women persisted. They demanded training. They demanded real work assignments. They refused to be sidelined. Why? Because they understood that their work mattered. Every airplane they helped build, every ship they helped weld, every bullet they helped manufacture, all of it was going to soldiers fighting to win the war. This sense of purpose gave women's factory work a meaning that transcended the daily grind. Yes, the work was hard. Yes, the hours were long. Yes, the conditions were often terrible. But women could endure all of that because they knew their work had value. They knew they were part of something larger than themselves. They were part of the greatest mobilization effort in American history. The connection between home front and battlefront was constantly reinforced by government propaganda and popular culture. Magazine articles featured stories of soldiers praising the factory workers who built their equipment. Newsreels showed footage of American bombers attacking German targets, with narrators reminding audiences that those planes were built by American workers, including millions of women. The message was everywhere. What you do at home matters to what happens on the battlefield. Women also expressed their patriotism through activities beyond factory work. They planted victory gardens, vegetable gardens designed to reduce the demand for commercially produced food so more could be sent to soldiers overseas. By 1944, Americans were tending more than 20 million victory gardens. Women did the vast majority of this gardening work. Gardening became another form of home front service. As one newspaper explained in 1943, the victory garden is a family affair, but with sons gone into the fighting forces and other members of the family in defense work. A much greater responsibility for farm victory rests on the shoulders of the women. Women not only worked in factories, they also managed households, raised children alone, and grew food to support the war effort. In rural areas, farm women took over entire agricultural operations when their husbands and sons left to fight. The slogan used to recruit women for agricultural work captured this spirit perfectly. In the front lines of war service, the farm women are cheerfully doing their fair share of the work, remembering that the more toil and sweat, the less blood and tears. The equation was simple. Hard work at home meant less sacrifice on the battlefield. Women also bought war bonds, donated blood, volunteered with the Red Cross, served as air raid wardens, and participated in scrap metal drives. Every action, no matter how small, was framed as patriotic service. And women embraced this framing. They wanted to serve. They wanted to contribute. They wanted to be part of the war effort. Letters written by Southern women during the war reveal this patriotic fervor in vivid detail. One woman wrote to General Douglas MacArthur explaining that she was sending him bags of American soil to be placed under flagpoles on conquered Pacific islands. She wrote, "I hope to be able to send enough of these bags to go on every island." She called them "For This We Fight" bags, symbolic reminders of what American soldiers were defending. This woman wasn't serving in uniform or working in a factory, but she found her own way to contribute to the war effort. The propaganda that recruited women to factory work emphasized that taking a war job was just as patriotic as enlisting in the military. One government recruitment campaign explained, "These jobs will have to be glorified as a patriotic war service if American women are to be persuaded to take them and stick to them. Their importance to a nation engaged in total war must be convincingly presented." And the campaign worked. Women responded in numbers that exceeded anyone's expectations. By 1944, women made up approximately 25% of war production workers. In some industries, like aircraft manufacturing, women constituted 65% of the workforce. These weren't women forced into factories against their will. These were volunteers. Women who chose to serve because they believed it was the right thing to do. One of the most powerful aspects of this patriotic motivation was how it cut across class lines. Middle-class women who had never worked outside the home took factory jobs. College-educated women with teaching degrees became welders and riveters. Women who had spent their lives in domestic comfort learned to operate massive industrial machinery. They did it because patriotism, in their minds, required sacrifice. It required stepping outside your comfort zone. It required doing things you never thought you could do. This wasn't blind patriotism. Women who took factory jobs understood the risks. They knew industrial work was dangerous. They knew they might be injured or killed on the job. They knew they would face discrimination and harassment. They knew that after the war ended, they would probably lose their jobs and be expected to return to traditional domestic roles. But they did it anyway. They did it because when your country is fighting for its survival, you do what needs to be done. The iconic Rosie the Riveter image captured this spirit perfectly. Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post cover from May 1943 showed Rosie as strong, confident, and capable, but also unmistakably patriotic. She was eating her lunch with an American flag behind her and her foot resting casually on a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. The symbolism was clear. American women were crushing fascism with their labor. J. Howard Miller's "We Can Do It" poster conveyed the same message. The woman in the poster wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't hesitant or uncertain. She was declaring her capability and her determination. And millions of American women saw that poster and said, "Yes, yes, I can do it. And I will do it. Because my country needs me." This patriotic motivation sustained women through the darkest moments of the war. When factory work became overwhelming, when supervisors were abusive, when coworkers were hostile, when the work seemed impossible, women kept going because they believed they were serving a higher purpose. They were defending freedom. They were protecting their loved ones. They were helping to win the war. For many women, taking a factory job during World War II was the most meaningful thing they ever did. Decades later, women who worked in defense plants during the war spoke about those years with pride. They spoke about the sense of purpose, the camaraderie with other women workers, and the satisfaction of knowing they had contributed something important to their country. So why did 6 million American women join epic factories to win World War II? For millions of them, the answer was simple. They did it out of love for husbands and sons fighting overseas, love for country, love for freedom. They did it because patriotic duty called them to serve, and they answered that call with courage, determination, and unwavering commitment. My husband is fighting, I can too. That sentiment, expressed by countless women in letters, diaries, and interviews, captured the heart of why women went to work in America's war factories. They couldn't carry rifles or fly fighter planes, but they could build them. And that was enough. That was their contribution. That was their war. But patriotism wasn't the only reason women flooded into America's war factories. There was another powerful motivation, one that was perhaps less romantic but just as real. Money, better wages, economic opportunity. For millions of American women, especially working-class women and women of color, defense industry jobs offered something they'd never had before: a real chance at financial independence and economic security. Let's be honest about something. Before World War II, most American women who worked outside the home were stuck in what were called women's jobs: teaching, nursing, secretarial work, retail sales, and domestic service. These jobs shared two characteristics: they were considered socially acceptable for women, and they paid terribly, especially domestic service. Consider this statistic. In 1940, more than 2.9 million American women worked in personal service industries, primarily as domestic servants. That meant cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, and caring for children in someone else's home. For Black women, the situation was even more dire. Nearly 60% of employed African American women worked as domestic servants before the war. 60%. 3 out of every 5 Black women who had jobs were cleaning white people's houses. And the pay? Miserable. Domestic servants in the early 1940s earned an average of about $2 per day, sometimes less. That's roughly $10 to $12 per week, assuming you could find steady work. Many domestic workers were paid by the day or by the job, with no benefits, no job security, and no prospect of advancement. You could work as a maid your entire life and never earn enough to support yourself comfortably, much less save money or help support a family. Now compare that to defense industry wages. In 1944, skilled female workers in war plants made an average weekly wage of $31.21. That's more than double what domestic workers earned. Even unskilled factory jobs paid around $20 per week. Suddenly, a Black woman who had been earning $10 per week scrubbing floors could earn $20 or $30 per week riveting airplane fuselages. For the first time in her life, she could afford rent, food, and clothes without constant financial anxiety. That wage difference changed lives. It changed entire families and entire communities. African American women fled domestic service in staggering numbers. By 1944, the percentage of Black women working in domestic service had dropped by 15.3%, while their employment in defense work had increased by 11.5%. Before the war, 9% of Black women workers held jobs in industry. By the end of the war, that number had doubled to 18%. This wasn't just about buying a few extra luxuries. For many women, those higher wages meant survival. Single mothers could feed their children. Wives whose husbands were overseas could pay the rent. Widows could support themselves without depending on charity or relatives. The economic independence that came with a factory job was transformative. Chinese American women experienced similar opportunities. Before the war, Chinese American women were largely confined to work within their own communities, in laundries, restaurants, or small family businesses. Wartime labor shortages opened doors that had always been closed. Chinese American women found jobs in defense plants, offices, and government agencies. They earned real wages and gained access to economic opportunities their mothers could never have imagined. For young, single women, the appeal of factory work was equally strong. Many came from rural areas where economic opportunities were virtually non-existent. A young woman in a small farming town in Iowa or Mississippi had limited options: marry young, work on the family farm, maybe teach school if she could afford the training. Factory work offered something different: adventure, independence, the chance to live in a city, earn her own money, and make her own decisions. One woman described her experience this way. She had been working as a teacher before the war, earning modest wages. When defense plants opened, she left teaching to become a riveter. The pay was 40% higher than her teaching salary. 40%. That extra money meant she could afford her own apartment, buy nice clothes, and save for the future. She wasn't abandoning patriotic duty, she was serving her country while also improving her economic situation. But here's what's important to understand. Women weren't taking factory jobs just for the money. They were taking these jobs because the money represented something larger: respect, independence, and opportunity. When a woman earned $30 per week, she wasn't just earning wages. She was proving she could support herself. She was contributing to her household as an equal partner, not a dependent. She was gaining economic power in a society that had always denied women that power. Married women, in particular, discovered something revolutionary. During the Great Depression, married women had been actively discouraged from working. The logic was simple: jobs were scarce, so women should stay home and let men support families. Many employers refused to hire married women. Many states passed laws barring married women from certain jobs, especially in government and education. Society treated married women who worked as selfish, as taking jobs away from men who needed them more. World War II shattered that attitude overnight. Suddenly, the government was begging married women to work. Federal propaganda campaigns specifically targeted housewives, urging them to take war jobs as a patriotic duty. And many married women discovered they liked working. They liked earning money. They liked the independence and the sense of purpose. They liked being part of something larger than their household. By 1945, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women worked outside the home. That was unprecedented. Before the war, most married women left the workforce when they got married or had children. Working outside the home as a married woman was socially unacceptable. But the war changed that. And many of those married women had no intention of going back to being full-time housewives when the war ended. The wages women earned during the war fueled the prosperity of the 1950s. Here's why. During the war years, consumer goods were scarce. Everything was rationed: food, gasoline, clothing, household items. There wasn't much to buy even if you had money. So millions of women working in defense plants did something smart. They saved. They opened savings accounts. They bought war bonds. They put away money for the future. When the war ended and those women left the workforce, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes because they were fired to make room for returning soldiers, they had something many American women had never had before: savings. Thousands of dollars saved over 4 years of factory work. And what did families do with that money? They bought houses. They put down payments on homes in the new suburbs springing up around American cities. That money helped launch the post-war housing boom and the economic prosperity of the 1950s. But we have to be honest about the limitations too. Yes, factory work paid better than domestic service or retail sales, but it didn't pay as well as the same work performed by men. This was one of the great injustices of the wartime economy. Women doing the exact same jobs as men, operating the same machinery, performing the same tasks, meeting the same production quotas, earned significantly less. A female worker rarely earned more than 50% of male wages. Think about that. A woman could do the same job as a man, work the same hours, produce the same results, and take home half the pay, sometimes even less. At the height of the war, skilled female workers earned an average of $31 per week, while skilled male workers earned considerably more. The wage gap was real, persistent, and profoundly unfair. Women protested this inequality. They filed complaints with the War Labor Board. They joined unions and demanded equal pay for equal work. Some unions supported women's demands. Others ignored them or actively opposed them. Male workers worried that if women received equal pay, employers might prefer to keep women workers after the war ended instead of rehiring men. So many male workers and union leaders actually fought against equal pay for women, even though unequal pay was blatantly discriminatory. Despite the pay gap, factory wages still represented a massive improvement for most women. A black woman who had earned $10 per week as a maid was thrilled to earn $20 per week as a factory operative, even if the white man working next to her earned $40 for the same work. Was it fair? Absolutely not. But it was still better than what she'd had before. And for many women, the economic benefits extended beyond just wages. Factory jobs came with things domestic service never offered: regular hours, days off, overtime pay, and sometimes even health benefits. You weren't at the beck and call of an employer who could demand you work late or come in on your day off. You punched a time clock, worked your shift, and went home. That predictability and structure was valuable. Women also gained access to training and skills that had economic value beyond the war. A woman who learned to weld, operate a lathe, read blueprints, or perform precision assembly work had marketable skills. Even if defense plants didn't hire her after the war, she could potentially find other work using those skills. She had credentials and experience that opened doors. For approximately 600,000 African American women, the economic opportunity represented by war work was nothing short of life-changing. These women fled oppressive and often demeaning jobs in domestic service and agriculture for better-paying work in defense industries. They endured discrimination, segregation, and harassment on the job. They were often the last hired and the first fired. But they persisted because the economic opportunity was too valuable to pass up. This economic motivation didn't contradict patriotism. Women could be both patriotic and economically motivated. They could believe in the war effort while also appreciating the paycheck. They could be proud of building bombers to defeat Hitler while also being grateful for the financial security that factory wages provided. The two motivations weren't mutually exclusive. They reinforced each other. One survey conducted at the end of the war asked women workers about their plans. Did they intend to keep working after the war ended, or did they plan to return to being full-time homemakers? The results surprised many government officials and industry analysts. The vast majority of women, especially those who had taken defense industry jobs, wanted to keep working. They wanted to keep the wages, the independence, and the sense of purpose that came with employment. This desire to keep working wasn't just about money, though money was certainly part of it. Women had discovered they were capable of more than society had ever told them. They had learned they could operate complex machinery, meet demanding production schedules, and master technical skills. They had proven to themselves and to the world that women's work wasn't limited to teaching, nursing, and housekeeping. The economic necessity that drove millions of women into war factories was real and powerful. For working-class women, women of color, single mothers, and widows, those factory wages meant the difference between poverty and security. For young single women, those wages meant independence and opportunity. For married women, those wages meant contributing to their household and gaining respect as economic partners. So when we ask why 6 million American women joined epic factories to win World War II, part of the answer is simple economics. They did it because defense industry jobs paid better than any work most of them had ever done before. They did it because those wages offered a chance at a better life, a life with financial security, economic independence, and the dignity that comes from earning your own way. The patriotic propaganda may have called women to serve their country, but the paychecks kept them on the factory floor, shift after shift, week after week, for 4 long years. And those paychecks changed not just individual women's lives, but the entire trajectory of women's economic participation in American society. So millions of American women wanted factory jobs. Some were motivated by patriotism, others by economic necessity, most by both. But wanting a factory job and actually being able to do a factory job were two very different things. The vast majority of women who volunteered for war work had absolutely no experience with industrial machinery, metalworking, or technical skills. How do you turn a housewife who's never operated anything more complicated than a sewing machine into a skilled riveter or welder in a matter of weeks? That was the challenge facing the United States government and American industry in 1942. And the solution they developed, a massive network of training programs, would prove to be one of the keys to America's wartime production miracle. Let's talk about what women needed to learn. Riveting, for example. That was one of the most common jobs assigned to women in aircraft factories. Riveting doesn't sound complicated. You're just driving metal pins through holes to fasten two pieces of metal together, right? Wrong. Riveting aircraft components required incredible precision, physical strength, and coordination. Here's how it worked. A riveter and a bucker worked as a team. The riveter held an air-powered rivet gun, a heavy, loud, vibrating tool, and pushed a short cylindrical metal pin called a rivet through a pre-drilled hole. On the other side of the metal, the bucker held a metal plate called a bucking bar. When the riveter fired the gun, the rivet slammed into the bucking bar with tremendous force, flattening the end of the rivet and creating a seal that held two metal plates together securely. Partners had to develop a rhythm. They had to coordinate their movements perfectly. The riveter had to hold that heavy, vibrating gun steady. The bucker had to position the bucking bar precisely. Together, an experienced team could complete hundreds of rivets per hour. But if you'd never done it before, if you'd never held an industrial power tool, if you'd never worked in coordination with a partner on technical work, it was hard, really hard. Welding was even more challenging. Wendy the welder, Rosie's less famous cousin, represented women who welded steel plates to build ships. Welding required heating metal to extreme temperatures using a torch that produced an intensely bright arc of light. That ultraviolet light could literally burn your eyes if you looked at it without protection. Welders had to wear dark goggles or helmets with UV filtering to prevent arc eye, a painful inflammation of the cornea that could permanently damage vision. Beyond the technical skill required, welding was dangerous. First-degree and second-degree burns were common. The fumes and gases released during welding contained heavy metals that caused serious long-term health problems. Many women who worked as welders during World War II suffered respiratory issues and other health complications for the rest of their lives. Operating other industrial machinery wasn't any easier. Drill presses, lathes, milling machines, giant stamping presses, all of these required training, skill, and constant attention to safety. One moment of distraction could result in crushed fingers, severed limbs, or death. Industrial factories were inherently dangerous places, and women needed to learn not just how to operate the machinery, but how to do so safely. So how did the government solve this training challenge? Through an enormous expansion of vocational education programs. Under the War Emergency Training Program, the federal government allocated $94 million to train workers for defense industries. $94 million in 1940s money, an absolutely massive investment. Vocational schools across the country were mobilized for the war effort. Schools opened their facilities during summer vacations and after regular school hours. Provinces and municipalities contributed the shops and equipment from their technical schools. New vocational schools were built specifically to train war workers. The Pensacola Vocational School in Florida, constructed in 1942, was dedicated entirely to training workers for defense jobs. What did these training courses teach? Everything women would need to work in war industries. At Pensacola Vocational School, for example, courses included oxyacetylene welding, airplane engine mechanics, airplane engine accessories, machine shop training, metalsmith work, blueprint reading, aircraft instruments, and electrical systems. These weren't casual evening classes. These were intensive programs designed to take someone with no industrial experience and turn them into a competent factory worker in weeks, not years. Blueprint reading was essential. Women needed to understand technical drawings showing exactly how parts should be assembled, where rivets should be placed, and what tolerances were acceptable. Machine shop training taught women how to operate lathes, drill presses, and other precision tools. Electrical training prepared women to wire aircraft instrument panels and electrical systems. The welding courses were particularly important. Before the war, welding had been an exclusively male trade requiring years of apprenticeship. But the shipbuilding industry desperately needed welders. Thousands of welders. In Pittsburgh, courses for female welding students began appearing in fall 1942. Women who had never imagined working with molten metal were learning to handle welding torches and join steel plates. And here's what amazed everyone. The women learned. They learned fast. They mastered skills that men had assumed required years of experience. Housewives who had never worked outside the home learned to read blueprints. Young women fresh out of high school learned to operate complex machinery. Women who had spent their lives cooking, cleaning, and raising children discovered they had aptitudes for technical work nobody had ever suspected. One article from the Pensacola News-Journal described the transformation this way. Who were these women in civilian life? They are the women who waved your hair, taught your children, typed your letters, stood behind counters in stores, who swished past you in white uniforms through hospital corridors, and who made the homes of America. From beauty shops, PTAs, shoe stores, and idleness, they have come to learn the mechanics of war. The article described these women standing beside huge machines, women in slacks whose hands looked more fitted to deal a hand of bridge than to handle implements of war. But they were doing it. They were learning. They were mastering skills that society had always told them were beyond women's capabilities. Training didn't just happen in vocational schools. Many women were trained directly in the factories themselves. Defense contractors set up on-site training programs to teach new workers the specific skills needed for their particular production lines. Aircraft manufacturers like Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, and Consolidated Aircraft created factory schools where new employees spent days or weeks learning their jobs before being assigned to production work. At Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, later known as Convair, the company developed comprehensive training programs specifically for women workers. They circulated training manuals and guides aimed at both new employees and management staff supervising them. These manuals explained not just technical procedures, but also how women could balance their new work responsibilities with home life. Some employers discovered that women actually had advantages in certain types of factory work. Experts speculated that women were particularly successful at riveting because it resembled sewing, assembling and seaming together pieces just like making a garment. Women's manual dexterity, developed through years of sewing, knitting, and detailed handwork, translated perfectly to the precision work required in aircraft assembly. Glenn Martin, co-founder of Martin Marietta, told a reporter, "We have women helping design our planes in the engineering departments, building them on the production line, and operating almost every conceivable type of machinery, from rivet guns to giant stamp presses." Women weren't just working on assembly lines. They were operating heavy machinery, reading technical drawings, performing quality control inspections, and contributing to engineering design. Government studies examined how women performed compared to men in defense industries. The results surprised skeptics. Reports found that women required less supervision and were decidedly easier to supervise than men. Labor turnover decreased when women were hired. Once women were employed in a plant, male employees made little objection to hiring additional women workers. With the same training and experience as men, women could be moved between departments or transferred to other jobs as readily as men. Perhaps most importantly, accident rates decreased when women joined factory workforces. The number of workplace injuries went down, not up. Damage to tools and materials was considerably less than when similar work was performed by men. This was particularly true when women operated small drill presses and worked with small precision parts. Women's attention to detail and careful work habits made them excellent factory workers. A Life magazine issue from 1943 put a female welder on its cover and described how women welders were sweating near blast furnaces, directing giant ladles of molten iron or pouring red-hot ingots. The magazine emphasized how quickly these women had been accepted in industries that just months earlier had refused to hire any women at all. By 1943, the aviation industry, which had employed less than 1% women when the war began, had a workforce that was 65% female. 16 million women were employed across the country. 1/4 of all employed women worked in war industries. This transformation happened in less than 2 years. It was unprecedented in speed and scale. The training programs worked because they were intensive, practical, and focused on real job skills. Women weren't given theoretical lectures about metalworking. They were put in front of actual machinery and taught hands-on how to operate it safely and efficiently. They practiced riveting on scrap metal until they could work at production speed. They practiced welding until they could create strong, clean seams. Women also learned by doing. Many women started in entry-level positions and learned additional skills on the job. A woman might start as a bucker, holding the bucking bar while a more experienced worker operated the rivet gun. After mastering that job, she'd switch roles and learn to operate the gun herself. Then she might move on to more complex assembly work or learn to operate different machinery or advance to inspection and quality control positions. What's crucial to understand is that this wasn't just job training. This was a social revolution disguised as vocational education. Every time a woman learned to weld, she was proving that welding wasn't inherently masculine work. Every time a woman learned to read blueprints, she was demonstrating that technical knowledge wasn't beyond women's intellectual capacity. Every time a woman mastered a skill that society had labeled men's work, she was challenging the fundamental assumptions that had limited women's opportunities for generations. The women themselves understood this. When interviewed, they repeatedly said the same thing. This is a woman's war too. We must help out, you know. They understood they were doing more than just learning job skills. They were proving what women could accomplish when given the opportunity and the training. And prove it they did. Within months of entering training programs, women were working on production lines alongside men, meeting the same quotas, maintaining the same quality standards, and performing the same jobs. The training revolution transformed American industry and transformed American women's understanding of their own capabilities. From housewives to Rosies, from homemakers to welders, from women who'd never held a power tool to skilled industrial workers, building the weapons that would win the war. The training programs made it possible, but the women made it happen. Imagine stepping through those factory gates for the first time. You've completed your training course. You've learned the basics of riveting or welding or machine operation. You've practiced on sample pieces. But now comes the real test. Your first day actually working in a war plant. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared you for what you were about to experience. The noise hit you first. The overwhelming, relentless, ear-shattering noise. At a ball bearing factory, one woman recalled, the noise was so bad that you could not hear each other without yelling. Imagine dozens, sometimes hundreds, of machines operating simultaneously. Drill presses, stamping presses, rivet guns firing thousands of times per hour, metal grinding against metal, the constant clang and crash of parts being moved, assembled, dropped. It was deafening. Many women who worked in factories during World War II suffered permanent hearing damage. At the Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver and Portland, over 31,000 women worked building ships by 1944. The shipyards operated around the clock, 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week. The yards were massive, covering hundreds of acres, employing tens of thousands of workers. When a woman walked through those gates on her first day, she saw something that looked like an industrial city. Cranes towering overhead, welding torches throwing bright sparks into the air, steel plates stacked stories high, ships in various stages of construction. The scale was overwhelming. One woman who went to work at U.S. Steel Duquesne Works in Pennsylvania remembered her first day vividly. She was hired on Memorial Day. They walked the new workers through a portion of the mill. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the whistle blew and church bells rang. Everyone was told to bow their heads and pray because it was wartime. She said, "That I'll never forget." That was so touching. Even in the midst of industrial chaos, there were moments of solemnity and collective purpose. But after that moment of prayer, the real work began. Another woman named Regina Kowalski applied to work at U.S. Steel Homestead Works. She was initially rejected because she was underweight. She begged them to hire her anyway. Finally, they agreed and gave her heavy steel-toed shoes to add weight. Before being allowed on the factory floor, women had to pass medical examinations. They were issued heavy pull-on overalls, safety glasses, hair coverings, and those mandatory steel-toed shoes. Kowalski recalled, "They give you some tests, how to put things together and this and that. Just like children. We thought we were children playing with toys. But this wasn't playing with toys." Kowalski said, "We went into the mill, and it was scary at first." She was assigned to a labor gang that had to unload boxcars full of bricks for the furnaces. So Kowalski and her coworkers picked up bricks and started carrying them. Hour after hour, day after day, back-breaking physical labor that left her exhausted. But Kowalski kept working because her husband had enlisted in 1941, and she needed an outlet for her anxiety and a way to contribute to the war effort. Not every woman's first day was terrifying. Helen Querini walked into an aircraft factory for her first day and was pleasantly surprised to discover her boss was a woman. "This is great," she thought. "Imagine a woman boss in the factory. Maybe this won't be such a bad place to work in after all." As she walked down the aisle, she felt the eyes of all the workers following her. She noticed rows and rows of tables on both sides of the aisles, workers seated about 4 feet apart. Panels, parts, screws, and nuts covered the tables. Some women were working with soldering irons, pliers, and screwdrivers. Querini presented her papers to her supervisor, a woman they called Anna B., because some found her Polish name hard to pronounce. Anna looked over Querini's papers and called a leader to show her where to hang her coat, where the ladies' room was, and where she would work. Querini was also taken to the tool crib, where she had to sign for the tools she would be using. This was standard procedure. Workers were responsible for their tools. If you lost a tool or broke one through carelessness, you might have to pay for it. Querini's leader was a woman named Stella, a caring woman who was kind and patient as she explained the ropes. Stella was a widow with a 10-year-old son whom she adored. Her husband had died several years earlier, and she had to work to support herself and her child. Stella and Querini later became good friends. They went to movies together, attended auctions, and socialized outside of work. For many women, the friendships they formed with other women workers were one of the best parts of factory work. But even in plants where supervisors were supportive and coworkers were friendly, the working conditions were harsh. Factory work was dirty, really dirty. One woman who worked at a ball-bearing factory recalled, "It was extremely dirty. There was oil on the floor, and the area where we worked was very crowded. The oil wasn't just on the floor, it was on the machinery, on the parts, on your clothes, on your hands. No matter how careful you were, you went home every day covered in grease and grime." At Ford's Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan, women made up approximately 1/3 of the workforce. Willow Run was one of the most ambitious manufacturing facilities ever constructed. The plant was over 3 million square feet, more than 67 acres under one roof. It housed the world's longest assembly line. At peak production, Willow Run produced one V-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. One complete 4-engine heavy bomber rolled off the assembly line every hour. Working at Willow Run meant working on that assembly line. The line never stopped. Components moved past your station, and you had minutes, sometimes just seconds, to complete your task before the next component arrived. You riveted a panel. You installed a part. You tightened bolts. You checked for defects. Over and over and over. For 8 hours. Sometimes 10 or 12 hours if you worked overtime. Which most women did, because the war effort demanded maximum production. One woman who had been a domestic servant before the war said, "I love it here, better than housework. I love machines. In the factory, you're finished at the same time every day." That predictability was valuable. Domestic servants were at their employer's beck and call, working irregular hours with no set schedule. Factory work was hard, but it was structured. You clocked in, worked your shift, and clocked out. Your time was your own after that. But not everyone loved factory work. One poll suggested that only 1 in 18 women thought factory work was an ideal job. Many women found the work monotonous, exhausting, and boring. Standing in one spot for hours, performing the same task hundreds of times per day, it was mind-numbing. The noise made conversation impossible. The pace was relentless. The supervisors were often harsh, demanding faster work and criticizing any mistakes. Working in steel mills was particularly grueling. One woman named Matter talked about how much she enjoyed the physicality of the work, the lifting, the stacking, the rolling, feeling the heat from open hearth furnaces lick at her body, the sweat. She even brushed off an incident where she was rolling steel bars on wooden skids. The bar rolled off the skid onto her foot, and she got hurt. Matter was driven by love of the work itself. But not every woman had Matter's enthusiasm for heavy physical labor. Women working in steel mills worked alongside men too old for the draft and other women like themselves, especially wives and mothers who felt called to mill work. The environment was overwhelmingly masculine. The language was rough. The work culture was aggressive. Women had to develop thick skins and learn to ignore crude comments, sexual harassment, and resentment from male coworkers who didn't want women in the mills. At the Kaiser shipyards, sexism was rampant. Many women were sexually harassed by their male peers or supervisors. This harassment often forced women to request transfers to different roles or locations. The local media treated women welders and riveters as outsiders, as a temporary solution to wartime labor needs. The message was clear: women were only there because men were at war. Once the men came home, women would return to the kitchen where they belonged. Despite earning the same wages as men for the same jobs at Kaiser, thanks to union contracts, women faced constant discrimination. They were given the least desirable shifts. They were passed over for promotions. They were assigned to the most dangerous or most unpleasant jobs. Male supervisors often assumed women couldn't handle difficult tasks and gave them easier work, which meant women had fewer opportunities to develop advanced skills. Working conditions weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. Women workers were injured, disabled, and even killed in industrial accidents. Heavy machinery could crush fingers or hands in an instant. Welding torches could cause severe burns. Falling parts could break bones or kill. Toxic fumes from welding and painting caused respiratory problems. The oil and grease on factory floors were slippery. Workers could fall and be injured by machinery. Safety equipment was often inadequate. Safety glasses didn't always fit properly. Steel-toed shoes were heavy and uncomfortable. Welding helmets and goggles sometimes failed to provide adequate UV protection, resulting in arc eye, a painful inflammation of the cornea. Women learned to work carefully, to stay alert every moment, to watch out for their coworkers. But accidents still happened with frightening regularity. Yet despite all these challenges, the noise, the dirt, the danger, the harassment, the exhaustion, millions of women kept showing up. Shift after shift, week after week, month after month. For 4 years, they kept working because they believed in what they were building. Every rivet they drove, every weld they completed, Every part they assembled was going into a weapon that would help win the war and bring their husbands and sons home safely. When Eleanor Roosevelt toured factories and shipyards, she was shocked at the new workforce. She saw women doing jobs that had always been considered impossible for women. She saw them operating massive machines, lifting heavy materials, working with dangerous equipment. And most importantly, she saw their pride. Women admitted they felt patriotic and wanted to support their country. They had become what people called production soldiers in the defense industry. That first day on the factory floor was overwhelming. The noise, the scale, the pace, the danger, it was all more than most women had imagined. But they adapted. They learned. They developed the skills and the toughness required to do the job. And they proved to everyone, especially to themselves, that they were capable of far more than society had ever told them they could do. The factories changed women. They walked in as housewives, domestic servants, shop clerks, and teachers. They walked out at the end of their shifts as riveters, welders, crane operators, and machinists. They had discovered strength they didn't know they possessed. They had learned skills they'd never imagined mastering. They had earned respect from supervisors, from coworkers, and most importantly, from themselves. That first day on the factory floor was just the beginning. Over the next months and years, these women would build the arsenal that won World War II. But it all started with that first terrifying, overwhelming, transformative day when they walked through the factory gates and discovered what they were truly capable of doing. Once women mastered the training and survived those first overwhelming days on the factory floor, they became part of the most remarkable production achievement in human history. America's aircraft industry during World War II didn't just increase production, it exploded. And women were the workforce that made that explosion possible. Here are the numbers, and they're staggering. In 1939, before the war, the American aircraft industry employed about 36,000 workers on the West Coast. By 1943, that number had increased to 474,000. A 15-fold increase in just 4 years. The entire industry grew from producing fewer than 6,000 military aircraft in 1939 to producing nearly 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. And women built those planes. By November 1943, 486,000 women worked in the American aircraft industry. They made up 36.6% of the entire industry's workforce nationwide. But that national average obscures the reality in specific plants and specific regions. In Southern California, the heart of American aircraft production, women made up 65% of the workforce in many airframe factories. 65%. Nearly 2 out of every 3 workers building America's bombers and fighters were women. At 5 major aircraft plants in Southern California, more than 10,000 women worked at each facility by June 1943. Douglas Aircraft at Long Beach employed 16,298 women. Douglas at Santa Monica employed 13,526 women. Lockheed at Burbank employed 13,437 women. Consolidated Vultee in San Diego employed 13,164 women. And Vega at Burbank employed 12,406 women. These weren't just women filling clerical positions or doing light assembly work. Women operated drill presses, welding torches, and heavy casting machinery. They riveted fuselage sections. They installed electrical systems. They assembled engines. They inspected finished aircraft. They worked in every department and performed nearly every job in the plants. The B-24 Liberator, the most produced American military aircraft in history, became the symbol of this transformation. More than 18,000 B-24s were built during the war. The bomber was massive, weighing 36,000 pounds empty and carrying a crew of 10. It had 4 engines, each producing 1,250 horsepower. It could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs over distances exceeding 2,000 miles. Building one B-24 required thousands of components, hundreds of thousands of rivets, miles of electrical wiring, and thousands of hours of skilled labor. At Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, which became the primary B-24 production facility, women were involved in every phase of manufacturing. From the initial fuselage assembly to final inspection, women's hands touched every part of every bomber that rolled off the production line. Each B-24 contained more than 300,000 rivets in more than 500 different sizes. Women drove those rivets. Women welded the fuel tanks. Women installed the instrument panels. Women assembled the wing structures. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan took aircraft production to an entirely new level. Henry Ford applied automobile assembly line techniques to bomber production with terrifying efficiency. The plant covered 3 million square feet, 67 acres under one roof. It housed the longest assembly line in the world. At peak production in 1944 and 1945, Willow Run employed 42,000 workers and produced 650 B-24 Liberators per month. That's one complete four-engine heavy bomber every hour around the clock. Women made up approximately one-third of Willow Run's workforce. They worked as riveters, the most iconic and recognizable job. Every completed B-24 at Willow Run required more than 300,000 rivets, and skilled women riveters accomplished much of this work. The symbolic Rosie the Riveter character was inspired by these real women who mastered this essential craft. Today, Rosie remains a feminist icon and a powerful reminder of women's contributions to the American economy. At Willow Run, women worked 54-hour weeks as standard, 9 hours per day, 6 days per week. Overtime was common, with many women working 10 or 12-hour shifts. But here's something important. Women and men were paid the same rate for the same work at Willow Run. Ford's union contracts guaranteed equal pay, which was uncommon in many other defense plants. The production numbers from Willow Run alone are almost incomprehensible. By 1945, despite there being two other major B-24 production facilities, Willow Run accounted for 70% of monthly B-24 production. The plant produced 8,700 B-24s total, nearly half of all Liberators ever built. Pilots and crews slept in a dormitory with 1,300 cots, waiting for the near-hourly birth of a new bomber. They would fly away to training bases or directly to combat zones. The Boeing Company in Seattle and Renton, Washington, produced the B-17 Flying Fortress, the other iconic American heavy bomber. Boeing's workforce grew from about 3,000 in 1939 to more than 31,000 by 1945. Women made up a substantial portion of this workforce. They worked in Seattle plants, Renton facilities, and two subassembly plants in Everett. One Everett plant made parts for the B-17, the other for the B-29 Super Fortress, the most technologically advanced bomber of the war. About half the workers in Boeing's B-17 plants were women. They assembled fuselage sections, installed engines, riveted wing panels, and performed final inspections. The Flying Fortress earned its name honestly. Each plane bristled with defensive armament and could absorb tremendous battle damage while bringing its crew home safely. American bomber crews loved the B-17, and they knew that many of those aircraft were built by women workers who took enormous pride in the quality of their work. Douglas Aircraft, which dominated commercial aviation before the war with 90% of the world's commercial air traffic flown on Douglas aircraft, converted entirely to military production. Douglas's wartime workforce peaked at 160,000 workers, far exceeding Boeing's employment. Women constituted the majority of Douglas workers at many facilities. They assembled attack aircraft, transport planes, and medium bombers that served on every front of the war. Lockheed produced the P-38 Lightning fighter, a distinctive twin-engine aircraft that proved highly effective in both Europe and the Pacific. Women assembled these complex fighters alongside men, operating the same machinery, reading the same blueprints, meeting the same production schedules. The 60 Pearl Harbor widows who applied for jobs at Lockheed and Vega in January 1942, motivated by their motto, "Keep them flying to avenge our husbands' deaths," were among the first women hired under the new policy of giving preference to those in need due to wartime emergency. Their aptitude test results were much better than average, shattering management's expectations about women's capabilities. Aircraft manufacturers initially didn't seriously consider hiring large numbers of women. They believed aircraft jobs were men's work requiring special skills and experience. They assumed women were physically too weak and unsuitable for most jobs. But the massive drain of young men to military service, combined with the industry's explosive expansion, forced manufacturers to explore new labor sources. And women proved every assumption wrong. Certain characteristics of aircraft production actually made women ideal workers. World War II aircraft were composed of thousands of small, light parts. The work required precision, attention to detail, and manual dexterity rather than brute strength. Jobs were increasingly segmented and simplified as assembly line techniques were applied to aircraft manufacturing. These simplified labor processes played to women's strengths. Women's manual dexterity, developed through years of sewing, knitting, and detailed handwork, translated perfectly to precision aircraft assembly. Experts speculated that women were particularly successful at riveting because it resembled sewing, assembling, and seaming together pieces like making a garment. Government studies found that women required less supervision and were decidedly easier to supervise than men. Labor turnover decreased. Accident rates actually went down when women joined the workforce. Damage to tools and materials was considerably less than when similar work was performed by men, particularly with small drill presses and precision parts. Glenn Martin, co-founder of Martin Marietta, told reporters, "We have women helping design our planes in the engineering departments, building them on the production line, and operating almost every conceivable type of machinery, from rivet guns to giant stamp presses." This wasn't an exaggeration. Women weren't just working assembly lines. They were contributing to engineering design, operating heavy machinery, performing quality control inspections, and working in virtually every department. The transformation happened with stunning speed. The aviation industry had employed less than 1% women when the war began. By 1943, just 2 years into American involvement, women made up 65% of the workforce in many plants. This was one of the fastest, most dramatic workforce transformations in industrial history. Training programs worked overtime to prepare women for aircraft work. Consolidated provided comprehensive training to its new employees, most of whom had no prior technical skills in aviation work. Women learned to read blueprints showing the exact specifications for thousands of different components. They learned to operate drill presses, rivet guns, welding torches, and other tools. They learned quality control standards, understanding that a single defective rivet or poorly welded seam could cause an aircraft to fail in combat, killing its crew. That responsibility weighed heavily on women workers. They knew the planes they built would carry American servicemen into combat. Many women had husbands, sons, or brothers in the military. The woman riveting a B-17 wing panel might wonder if her husband would fly in that exact plane. The woman installing electrical systems in a P-38 fighter might imagine her brother piloting that aircraft over enemy territory. This personal connection to the end product gave women's work meaning beyond just earning a paycheck. Camaraderie developed among factory workers. Many were roommates, largely due to chronic wartime housing shortages. They shared social activities, supported each other through difficult times, and formed friendships that lasted long after the war ended. This sense of community helped women endure the long hours, dangerous working conditions, and physical exhaustion that came with aircraft production work. The aircraft these women built won the war. American air superiority over Europe crushed German industry and military capacity. The bomber offensive against Japan destroyed the enemy's ability to continue fighting. American fighters dominated the skies over every battlefield. American transport aircraft moved troops and supplies across oceans and continents. None of that would have been possible without the 300,000 women who worked in aircraft plants, who mastered complex skills, who met impossible production quotas, who built the greatest air armada in human history. By war's end, American factories had produced more than 300,000 military aircraft. 300,000 planes in less than 5 years. It was a production miracle that Germany and Japan could never match. And 65% of the workers who built those aircraft in many plants were women. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just factories and machinery. It was people. It was women who learned to rivet and weld and assemble. It was women who worked 54-hour weeks, who endured dangerous conditions, who took pride in building weapons that would bring their loved ones home safely and end the most destructive war in history. Every B-24 that bombed German oil refineries, every B-17 that flew over Berlin, every P-38 that shot down enemy fighters, every transport plane that landed on Pacific Islands, women built them. Women's labor, women's skill, women's dedication transformed the American aircraft industry and helped win World War II. Aircraft weren't the only weapons women built. America's victory in World War II depended equally on naval power, the ability to transport millions of troops across oceans, supply armies fighting on distant continents, and defeat enemy fleets in the Pacific. Building that Navy required an explosion of shipyard production that was even more dramatic than the aircraft industry's growth. And once again, women made it possible. The statistics tell an incredible story. In 1939, before America entered the war, only 2% of the shipbuilding workforce in the United States was female. 2%. Shipbuilding had always been considered the most masculine of industries: heavy steel plates, dangerous welding, massive cranes, brutal physical labor. Nobody imagined women could do this work. By 1944, more than 31,000 women were building ships just at the 3 Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver and Portland alone. 31,000 women in just 3 shipyards. At Portland's Kaiser yards, 28,000 women comprised 30% of the workforce. At Kaiser's Richmond, California shipyards, 1/3 of the 90,000-person workforce were women. At some other shipyards, women made up 60% of workers. The transformation was complete and stunning. Kaiser shipyards became legendary for production speed and efficiency. Using assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing, Kaiser built 30% of American wartime shipping vessels. The company's Northwest operations alone, 3 shipyards in Portland and Vancouver, employed over 100,000 workers at peak production. These yards built Liberty ships, Victory ships, escort carriers, tankers, troop transports, and LST landing ships. Liberty ships were the workhorses of the war effort. These standardized cargo vessels measured 441 feet long and 56 feet wide. Each could carry 2,840 jeeps, 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition. The ships operated at 11 knots, not fast, but reliable and easy to build in massive numbers. Each Liberty ship cost just under $2 million and required about 150,000 rivets to assemble. The construction process was revolutionary. Some 250,000 parts were prefabricated throughout the country in 250-ton sections and shipped to the yards where workers welded them together. This prefabrication and welding, rather than traditional riveting, allowed unprecedented construction speed. When the first Liberty ship, the Star of Oregon, launched from Portland's Oregon shipyard in September 1941, construction had taken 131 days. By 1943, Kaiser workers were completing a Liberty ship on average in just 42 days. 3 ships per day. But Kaiser shattered even that record. In November 1942, workers at Kaiser's Richmond, California shipyard assembled the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. 4 days. From gill laying to launch. For a 441-foot cargo ship. It was a publicity stunt meant to boost morale and demonstrate American industrial might, but it proved what was possible when skilled workers, efficient processes, and relentless determination combined. Women were integral to every phase of shipbuilding. They worked as welders, perhaps the most skilled and dangerous job in the yards. Wendy the welder became the shipyard equivalent of Rosie the riveter, representing the thousands of women who learned to weld steel plates to build ship hulls. Phyllis Gould, who worked at Richmond's Kaiser yards, recalled, "I worked building the deck houses 3 stories high. I had to climb a ladder with a coil of welding line on my shoulder." Rose Benavida, working on aircraft rather than ships, set a production record on June 8, 1943, by driving 3,345 rivets in 1 work shift. For this astonishing feat, the press dubbed her Rosie the Riveter, and she received a personal letter of commendation from President Franklin Roosevelt. Her extraordinary ability demonstrated that women could not only do the work, they could do it better and faster than anyone imagined. Women operated cranes, drove forklifts, worked as electricians, installed piping systems, painted ship hulls, and performed inspections. They did the same work men did and were exposed to the same occupational and health hazards. Women suffered burns from welding torches, crushing injuries from falling steel plates, and long-term respiratory damage from toxic fumes and paint. By war's end, Richmond's Kaiser shipyards had built more than 1,000 Liberty and Victory-class freighters and cargo ships, with women's labor essential to every single vessel. The Kaiser shipyards pioneered something revolutionary beyond just production techniques: equal pay. Women in Kaiser yards, protected by union contracts, earned the same wages as men for the same jobs. This was uncommon in most defense industries where women typically earned 50 to 60% of male wages. At Richmond's Kaiser yards, 30,000 women earned equal pay working alongside 60,000 men. Kaiser also established comprehensive social services for workers. The company built the city of Vanport on Portland's northern edge to house 42,000 workers and their families in 9,942 housing units. Kaiser created child care centers for working mothers, established a health care system that became the foundation for Kaiser Permanente, and provided cafeterias, transportation, and other support services. These innovations recognized that women workers had different needs than male workers, particularly regarding childcare. But not every shipyard was as progressive as Kaiser. Women faced significant discrimination, harassment, and hostility in many yards. At Kaiser's Vancouver yards, sexism was rampant. Many women were sexually harassed by male peers or supervisors, often forcing them to request transfers to different roles or locations. Local media treated women welders and riveters as outsiders, temporary solutions who would return to the kitchen once the war ended. Black women faced even worse discrimination. African American women were systematically blocked from lucrative shipyard jobs in many locations. In Portland and Vancouver, Black women were continuously and almost universally excluded from war work despite using the same tactics that had succeeded for Black women in cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Richmond, California. When Black women did get hired, they were confined to the least skilled, lowest-paying positions: laborers, janitors, kitchen workers, rather than welders, riveters, or electricians. In Mobile, Alabama, the shipbuilding boom transformed the local economy and created opportunities for thousands of women. The Alabama Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company on Pinto Island and Gulf Shipbuilding Company in Chickasaw together employed approximately 40,000 workers at peak production. These yards were turning out nearly one ship per week, a staggering pace. ADDSCO built 20 Liberty ships and 102 massive T2 tankers, each displacing over 22,000 tons. The yard also repaired or converted more than 2,800 ships for the Army, Navy, War Shipping Administration, and private companies. Gulf Shipbuilding launched 7 Fletcher-class destroyers, 29 minesweepers, 30 tankers, 1 landing ship dock, and several cargo vessels. Fletcher-class destroyers were highly regarded for their speed, durability, and combat power, becoming staples of the Navy's surface fleet. 2,500 women worked at Alabama Dry Dock. 1,200 worked at Gulf Shipbuilding. 750 more worked at Brooklyn Army Airfield, where aircraft underwent modifications and repairs. Women would hold nearly a quarter of defense-related jobs in Mobile by war's end. Mobile's contribution extended beyond shipbuilding. The port of Mobile ranked as the 15th busiest in the United States during the war, serving as a critical hub for transporting raw materials and finished goods to global battlefronts. Nearby, the Aluminum Company of America operated a plant at the state docks, processing thousands of tons of imported bauxite daily to produce aluminum, essential for aircraft manufacturing. The Alcoa plant alone produced 34% of the nation's aluminum by 1943. Women worked in this plant too, operating machinery and performing quality control. Nationwide, 2,711 Liberty ships were built from American shipyards between 1941 and 1945. Portland's Oregon shipyard built 330 Liberty ships, 99 Victory ships, and 33 attack transports. Vancouver's shipyard built 16 Liberty ships, 31 Victory ships, 49 escort carriers, 21 troop transport ships, and 30 LST landing ships. Swan Island shipyard built 146 tankers. The ships women built won the war. Liberty ships carried the troops and supplies for the D-Day invasion of Normandy. They supplied American forces fighting across North Africa, Italy, and France. They transported ammunition, food, fuel, vehicles, and everything else an army needed to fight thousands of miles from home. In the Pacific, these ships carried Marines island to island, transported equipment to build airfields on captured atolls, and kept American forces supplied during the brutal campaigns across the Pacific. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built on merchant ship hulls, provided air cover for convoys and amphibious invasions. Many of these escort carriers were built at Kaiser's Vancouver Yard, with women performing crucial assembly work. LST landing ships, vessels designed to transport tanks and troops directly onto invasion beaches, were essential for amphibious operations. Women built those too. The destroyers, minesweepers, and tankers women built in Mobile and elsewhere gave America naval supremacy in both the Atlantic and Pacific. These ships hunted German U-boats, escorted convoys, bombarded enemy positions, and fought in every major naval battle of the war. American sailors trusted their lives to ships built partially or entirely by women workers who took pride in the quality of their welding, riveting, and assembly work. By war's end, Kaiser's operations quickly wound down. By late 1945, only about 10,000 men and 2,000 women worked in the 3 Northwest yards. Operations soon ceased completely. The massive influx of women into shipyards proved temporary. As soon as the war ended, most women were laid off to make room for returning servicemen. But the contribution couldn't be erased. Women had proven they could handle the heaviest, most demanding industrial work imaginable. They had welded steel, operated massive cranes, built ships weighing thousands of tons. They had worked in conditions that were dangerous, exhausting, and often hostile. And they had done it with skill, dedication, and pride. One woman summed up the experience this way: Rosie the Riveters, or welders, put together some 142 ships. It was not easy work. But in doing so, they were pioneers, 30,000 women earning equal pay with 60,000 men. It was nothing less than the start of women's liberation, 7 decades ago. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just aircraft. It was ships, thousands of ships built faster than anyone thought possible, built by workers nobody thought could do the job, built by women who proved every assumption wrong and helped win the greatest war in history. Not every woman who served during World War II worked in a factory or shipyard. Over 350,000 American women served in uniform, wearing the uniforms of the United States Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. These women didn't just take clerical jobs to free men for combat. They performed more than 200 different military occupational specialties, working as mechanics, radio operators, air traffic controllers, cryptographers, intelligence analysts, and dozens of other essential roles. The Women's Army Corps, WAC for short, became the largest and most visible of the women's military services. But it didn't start that way. The road to creating the WAC was long and filled with resistance. Congresswoman Edith Nourse Rogers of Massachusetts first introduced a bill in May 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor, to establish a women's corps in the United States Army. Rogers had witnessed how women who served in World War I received no official status, no benefits, and no recognition. She was determined that if women served in the next war, they would receive the same rights and benefits as men. The bill initially went nowhere. The War Department wasn't interested. Congress wasn't interested. But then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Suddenly, the military needed more personnel than it could possibly recruit from the male population alone. Rogers reintroduced her bill, and this time it passed. On May 15, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the bill creating the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAC. But here's the catch. The WAC was established as an auxiliary, not as part of the actual army. Women who joined were called WACs, and they had official status and received a salary. But they didn't receive full military benefits. They didn't have the same rank structure as men. They weren't covered by military law. They were attached to the army, but not actually in the army. This second-class status created enormous problems. Oveta Culpabi, a newspaper executive and former parliamentarian of the Texas state legislature, became the first director of the WAC. Hobby was a brilliant administrator and a tireless advocate for the women under her command. She understood that overcoming public resistance to women in the military required careful public relations. Her message was simple and effective. Each woman serving would release a man for combat. This framing made women's military service acceptable to a skeptical public. Women weren't trying to be soldiers. They were supporting soldiers. Recruitment began immediately. The WAC established an age range of 21 to 45 for enlisted women, with different age requirements for officers. Women had to pass physical examinations and demonstrate basic educational qualifications. Training began at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, where the first WAC officer candidates arrived in July 1942. The response exceeded expectations. By July 1943, thousands of women had enlisted. But the auxiliary status continued to cause problems. Women couldn't receive the same medical care as male soldiers. They couldn't receive death benefits if killed in service. They couldn't receive veterans' benefits after discharge. Finally, in July 1943, Congress passed legislation dropping the auxiliary designation. The WAC became the WAC, the Women's Army Corps, with full military status. Women who had joined as WACs had to re-enlist in the new WAC to receive full benefits. 16,000 women who had joined the auxiliary but didn't transition were belatedly granted veterans' benefits in 1980, nearly 40 years later. By war's end, more than 150,000 women had served in the WAC. They worked in over 239 different military occupational specialties. Some roles were traditional: typists, file clerks, stenographers, telephone operators. But many were decidedly non-traditional. The Army Air Forces, predecessor to the Independent Air Force, eagerly recruited WACs. Eventually, the Air Forces obtained 40% of all WACs in the Army. Women worked as weather observers and forecasters. They served as cryptographers, breaking enemy codes and protecting American communications. They operated and repaired radios. They worked as sheet metal workers and parachute riggers. They instructed pilots on link trainers, early flight simulators. They maintained and repaired bomb sites, the precision instruments that enabled accurate bombing. They analyzed aerial reconnaissance photographs, identifying enemy positions and assessing bomb damage. They worked as control tower operators, directing aircraft traffic at busy airfields. Over 1,000 WACs operated the statistical control tabulating machines, the precursors of modern computers, used to track personnel records across the entire Army. By January 1945, only 50% of AAF WACs held traditional clerical assignments. The other half performed technical, skilled, and specialized work. A few Army Air Forces WACs even flew. 2 WAC radio operators assigned to Mitchell Field, New York, flew as crew members on B-17 training flights. WAC mechanics and photographers made regular flights. 3 WACs were awarded air medals for their service, including one serving in India who helped map the hump. The dangerous mountainous air route pilots flew to ferry Lend-Lease supplies to the Chinese Army. One woman died in the crash of an aerial broadcasting plane. The Army Service Forces, which handled logistics, supply, and administration, received 40% of WACs. Women assigned to the Ordnance Department computed bullet velocities, measured bomb fragments, mixed gunpowder, and loaded artillery shells. They worked as draftsmen, mechanics, and electricians. Some received training in ordnance engineering. 3,600 WACs served in the Transportation Corps, processing soldiers for overseas deployment, managing personnel files, and issuing weapons. One WAC described her work this way: "Soldiers come in here unarmed and leave with a gun. It gives me a pretty good feeling." WACs served as boat dispatchers and classification specialists, managing the complex logistics of moving millions of soldiers around the globe. WACs served overseas in North Africa, Europe, and Asia. They experienced the same dangers as male soldiers: air raids, artillery bombardments, and the constant stress of living in war zones. They earned commendations, medals, and the respect of the men they served alongside. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, specifically requested additional WAC units because he valued their efficiency and professionalism. The Navy's equivalent, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, or WAVES, was established on July 30th, 1942. Unlike the WAC, the WAVES was created from the beginning as part of the Naval Reserve with full military status. Lieutenant Commander Mildred McAfee, on leave from her position as president of Wellesley College, became the first director. She was later promoted to commander and then captain. The acronym WAVES was created by Lieutenant Elizabeth Reynard, one of the first women officers commissioned into the Naval Reserve. Reynard specifically wanted to emphasize that WAVES were volunteers serving temporarily for the duration of the war plus 6 months. WAVES received training at college campuses across the country. Officers trained at the Naval Reserve Midshipman School at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. Enlisted personnel received recruit and specialized training at colleges, including Hunter College in New York. By the end of World War II, more than 86,000 women had served in WAVES. At peak strength in July 1945, the organization had 73,816 enlisted women, 8,745 officers, and nearly 4,000 in training. Waves filled billets at 900 shore locations across the United States. While 38 different ratings were open to women, the majority worked in clerical, healthcare, or supply roles. Approximately 14,000 served as yeoman administrative specialists. 13,000 waves served as hospital corpsmen, providing medical care to wounded sailors. But waves also performed highly skilled technical work. Women served as codebreakers in the Office of Naval Operations' highly secretive communications division in Washington. These women broke Japanese naval codes, providing crucial intelligence that helped win the Pacific War. Waves managed the fleet's post offices, ensuring millions of letters reached sailors serving around the world. They worked as aviation mechanics, radar operators, navigation instructors, and gunnery instructors. The Marine Corps created its own women's reserve on July 30th, 1942, the same day as Waves. Unlike the other services, the Marine Corps Women's Reserve never received an official nickname. These women were simply called Lady Marines or Women Marines. Ruth Cheney Streeter was appointed the first director. The Marine Corps set demanding standards for its women recruits. They wanted only the best candidates. However, the Marine Corps Women's Reserve did not accept African American or Japanese American women during World War II, though they did accept Native American women. This discriminatory policy was shameful and reflected the racism prevalent in American society. Officer candidates trained at the Navy's Midshipman School for Women at Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, Massachusetts. Enlisted women initially trained at the Naval Training School at Hunter College. On July 1, 1943, the Marine Corps established its own training center at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. At peak strength, approximately 19,000 women served in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. They served at shore and air stations across the continental United States. Hawaii, then an incorporated territory, was the only overseas location where women Marines were assigned. They worked in professional, semi-professional, clerical, skilled trades, service, and sales occupations. By war's end, women Marines had proven themselves capable and invaluable members of the Corps. The Coast Guard established SPARS, an acronym derived from the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready, in November 1942. Captain Dorothy Stratton, formerly Dean of Women at Purdue University and a Waves officer, became the first SPARS director. More than 10,000 women served in SPARS during the war. SPARS officers trained at the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut, marking the first time women trained at a United States military service academy. This groundbreaking decision set the stage for the permanent admission of female cadets decades later. To join SPARS, women had to be United States citizens between ages 20 and 36, have completed at least 2 years of high school, and pass strict physical requirements. The Coast Guard sought women with professional and technical skills, particularly those with experience in clerical work, communications, engineering, and maritime-related fields. Across all services, women in uniform faced skepticism, discrimination, and hostility. Many male officers and enlisted men resented women's presence. Some questioned women's capabilities. Others worried that women would undermine military discipline and effectiveness. But the women proved themselves again and again. They performed their duties with competence, professionalism, and dedication. They earned respect through excellence. The 350,000 women who served in uniform during World War II weren't playing at being soldiers. They were real members of the United States military, performing essential jobs that contributed directly to winning the war. They broke barriers, challenged assumptions, and demonstrated that women's service to the nation extended far beyond traditional roles. And they paved the way for all the women who would serve in the United States military in the decades to come. Of all the roles women filled during World War II, perhaps the most daring and dangerous was that of the Women Air Force Service pilots, WASP. These women didn't just work around airplanes. They flew them. They flew every type of military aircraft the Army Air Forces possessed, from nimble fighters to massive four-engine bombers. They flew missions that terrified male pilots. And they did it all without official military status, without military benefits, and without recognition for decades after the war ended. The WASP story actually begins with two separate programs created in September 1942. Nancy Harkness Love, an experienced pilot married to a senior air transport command officer, proposed creating a women's auxiliary ferrying squadron, WFS, to ferry aircraft from factories to military bases. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, approved Love's proposal. At the same time, legendary aviator Jacqueline Cochrane returned from England, where she had been studying the British Air Transport Auxiliary, which employed women pilots. Cochrane had sent 25 highly qualified American women pilots to Britain to gain experience with the ATA. When she learned that Arnold had approved the WFS under Love's direction, Cochrane immediately lobbied for an expanded program. She argued that women could do far more than just ferry planes. They could perform nearly every non-combat flying mission. Arnold agreed and authorized Cochrane to create the Women's Flying Training Detachment, WFD, to train women pilots at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. On August 5, 1943, the WFS and WFD merged to create the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP, with Cochrane as director and Love heading the ferrying division. The requirements for WASP candidates were demanding. Applicants had to be between 21 and 35 years old, over 5 feet 4 inches tall, high school graduates, and already possess a pilot's license with significant flying experience. These weren't beginners learning to fly. These were experienced aviators who would receive military flight training. Over 25,000 women applied. Only 1,830 were accepted into the training program. The training was rigorous, the Army way, as the women called it. Trainees completed 4 months of intensive instruction at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, including 560 hours of ground school and 210 hours of flight training. They studied Morse code, meteorology, military law, physics, aircraft mechanics, and navigation. By graduation, they had completed the same basic training as male Army pilots, everything except combat training and aerobatics. The washout rate was high. Many qualified applicants couldn't handle the intense physical and mental demands of military flight training. Of the 1,830 women accepted, 1,074 earned their wings and graduated as WASP pilots. These were America's most elite women aviators. After graduation, WASPs were stationed at 122 bases across the United States. Bernice B. Haydu, a WASP veteran, recalled that WASPs performed about 22 different jobs. But their primary mission was ferrying aircraft, and they excelled at it. WASPs flew 80% of all ferrying missions during the war, delivering 12,652 aircraft of 78 different types. Here's how ferrying worked. A new aircraft rolled off the production line at a factory, say a P-51 Mustang fighter at North American Aviation in California. A WASP would fly to the factory, test fly the aircraft to ensure it was airworthy, then deliver it to a military base, perhaps in Florida or Texas or anywhere across the country. Then she'd catch transport back and do it again. And again. Some WASPs ferried dozens or even hundreds of aircraft during their service. WASPs flew everything. Literally everything the Army Air Forces had. The P-51 Mustang, the hottest fighter of the war. The P-38 Lightning twin-engine fighter. The P-47 Thunderbolt. The B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bomber. The B-24 Liberator. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced and expensive aircraft of the war, the plane that would eventually drop atomic bombs on Japan. The C-47 Transport, training aircraft, experimental aircraft, even early jet aircraft. Nancy Love became the first woman to fly a bomber across the Atlantic Ocean. Jackie Cochran became the first woman to fly many types of military aircraft. These women weren't just pilots, they were pioneers, pushing the boundaries of what people believed women could do. But ferrying wasn't the WASP's only mission. They performed what Cochran herself called the dishwashing jobs of the Army, the dangerous, unglamorous missions that male pilots didn't want. One of the most terrifying was towing targets for live anti-aircraft artillery practice. On July 19, 1943, Cochran announced this secret assignment to 25 recent WASP graduates at Avenger Field. She told them honestly what the mission involved, flying aircraft slowly and predictably while towing a fabric target behind them. Men on the ground would fire live ammunition at the target. Cochran said any WASP could opt out. None did. The WASPs flew to Camp Davis to begin target towing missions. Many of the planes were shot during training, sometimes by accident when servicemen mistakenly believed they were supposed to shoot the plane, not the target. Several WASPs were shot in the feet. The planes used for target towing, particularly old A-24 dive bombers, were often poorly maintained, using wrong octane fuel and suffering mechanical failures. On August 23, 1943, WASP Mabel Virginia Rawlinson died when her A-24 experienced mechanical problems during a night training flight. The instructor asked her to return to the airfield, but on final approach, Rawlinson's plane hit the top of a pine tree, nose down, and crashed. The instructor was thrown clear, but Rawlinson was trapped in the front seat as the plane burst into flames. She couldn't open the broken canopy lock. The investigation found that the towing planes were not properly maintained and the Army Air Corps was using incorrect fuel. Rawlinson's death was the first of 38 WASPs who would die during their service. 11 died in training accidents. 27 died during missions. The first WASP killed was Cornelia Ford, who had been a civilian flight instructor in Hawaii and was airborne when Pearl Harbor was bombed. Her plane was hit by machine gun fire from a Japanese Zero. Ford survived that attack, became one of the first women to join the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, and was the first WASP to die, killed on March 21, 1943, in a midair collision during a training flight. The final WASP death occurred on November 25, 1944. Hazeling Lee, a Chinese-American pilot who had volunteered to fly for China during the Sino-Japanese War before joining WASP, died from wounds received when her plane collided with another aircraft on November 23. 38 women gave their lives. But here's the heartbreaking part. These women had no military status. They were technically civilian employees. When they died, their families received no military benefits. No flag-draped coffins, no military funerals, no death benefits. The government didn't even pay to transport their bodies home. Jackie Cochran, Nancy Love, and fellow WASP pilots had to raise money themselves to pay for funeral expenses and to send their fallen sisters' remains home to their families. Despite the dangers and the lack of recognition, WASPs performed brilliantly. They flew over 60 million miles during the war. 60 million miles. They transported cargo and personnel. They flew searchlight tracking missions. They tested newly repaired aircraft before male pilots would fly them, essentially acting as human guinea pigs to see if the repairs were adequate. They trained male pilots in instrument flying, gunnery, and navigation. They flew simulated strafing missions. They performed every type of mission male Army Air Force's pilots flew except actual combat. By December 1944, 915 women pilots were on duty with the Army Air Forces. 620 served with Training Command, 141 with Air Transport Command, 133 with numbered air forces in the continental United States, 11 with the weather wing, 9 with technical commands, 1 with troop carrier command. And then, suddenly, it ended. In December 1944, with the war clearly turning in the Allies' favor, Congress declined to militarize the WASP program. Male pilots returning from combat needed jobs. The pilot shortage that had created the need for WASP no longer existed. General Arnold announced the program would be disbanded on December 20th, 1944. On December 7th, 1944, 3 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, the final class of 71 WASP pilots graduated. 2 weeks later, the program ended. Some WASPs offered to continue flying for $1 per year. The offer was rejected. General Arnold ordered that all WASPs be given certificates similar to honorable discharges, but these weren't actual military discharges because WASPs had never been granted military status. Some WASPs were allowed to fly home on government aircraft if space was available. Others had to arrange and pay for their own transportation. Just like that, 1,074 women who had flown 60 million miles, ferried 12,652 aircraft, and proven that women pilots were every bit as capable as men, were sent home. No military benefits, no veteran status, no recognition. It took 33 years for that injustice to be corrected. In 1977, Congress finally granted WASPs veteran status. In 2009, they received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. President Barack Obama signed the legislation, finally giving these pioneering women the recognition they deserved. By then, many had already passed away, never receiving the acknowledgement they'd earned. General Arnold, in his final orders disbanding the WASP, wrote, "The WASP has completed its mission. Their job has been successful, but as is usual in war, the cost has been heavy. 38 WASP have died while helping their country move toward the moment of final victory. The Air Forces will long remember their service and their final sacrifice." He was right. The Air Forces did remember. America remembered. And the legacy of those 1,074 women who earned their wings, who flew every type of military aircraft, who proved that women belonged in the cockpit, lives on in every woman who has flown military aircraft since. The WASPs opened the sky to women pilots, and the sky has never been closed to them again. The story of women in World War II factories isn't just a story of triumph and empowerment. For millions of women, particularly women of color, it's also a story of discrimination, harassment, and systematic exclusion. African American women, Latino women, Asian American women, and Native American women all faced obstacles that white women never encountered. They had to fight 2 battles simultaneously, the battle to prove that women could do war work, and the battle against racism that tried to keep them out entirely. On June 20th, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802. The order banned discrimination in defense industries and government employment based on race, creed, color, or national origin. Roosevelt created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FPC, to investigate discrimination complaints and enforce the order. It was a landmark moment, the first federal action against employment discrimination since Reconstruction. But here's the reality. Executive Order 8802 was rarely enforced and mostly ignored by employers until they had exhausted the white labor supply. Even then, war industries typically filled their most menial and dangerous positions with black employees, frequently assigning them to night shifts and janitorial positions. African American women suffered both racial and gender discrimination, so they had to fight extraordinarily hard even to enter skilled positions on production lines in aircraft manufacturing, shipyard work, and other well-paying war industries. Before the war, Nearly 60% of employed black women worked as domestic servants, cooking, cleaning, and caring for white families' homes and children for poverty wages. Defense industry jobs offered the chance to escape that grinding exploitation, but getting hired proved incredibly difficult. Employers made excuses. They claimed black women lacked the necessary education or skills. They worried that white workers would refuse to work alongside black women. They insisted that hiring black women would slow production and cause workplace conflicts. Historian Karen Anderson coined a phrase that captured black women's experience perfectly: last hired, first fired. When labor shortages became desperate, when every available white woman had been recruited and factories still needed workers, only then would employers reluctantly hire black women. And when the war ended and production slowed, black women were the first workers laid off to make room for white workers, particularly returning white male veterans. The discrimination took many forms. At defense plants across the country, black women were confined to the dirtiest, most dangerous, lowest-paying jobs. They worked in munitions plants mixing explosives, work so dangerous that white women refused to do it. They cleaned bathrooms, swept floors, and hauled materials while white women operated machinery and performed skilled assembly work. They worked night shifts while white women worked days. Even when black women had the same education and skills as white women, they were passed over for promotions and better assignments. Segregation was pervasive and humiliating. Many defense plants maintained separate restrooms for black and white workers, separate locker rooms, separate cafeteria tables. In some plants, black workers had to use different entrances. In 1943, a Baltimore Western Electric plant was forced to build separate toilet facilities for white and black workers when white women demanded them. This wasn't the Deep South. This was happening everywhere, north and south, east and west. Black women's presence in defense plants sometimes triggered hate strikes. White workers, often white women, would walk off the job when black workers were hired or promoted into previously restricted departments. These strikes disrupted production and gave employers another excuse not to hire black women. White workers claimed they couldn't work alongside black people. They demanded segregated facilities. They refused to take orders from black supervisors. At the Charlestown Navy Yard in Massachusetts, African American women worked as clerks, electrician helpers, mechanics, and welders. But they faced constant prejudice. Between July 1943 and December 1944, black women across the country filed at least one out of every 4 race discrimination cases to the Fair Employment Practices Committee. 2 women at Charlestown, Mabel Kahn and Helen Lee Franklin, filed complaints about discrimination they experienced. The FPC dismissed 7 out of 8 race discrimination cases at Charlestown, with only 1 remaining active. The agency created to fight discrimination proved largely toothless. At Richmond's Kaiser Shipyards, one of the more progressive employers that offered equal pay, black women still faced discrimination. A thesis titled, "They are hiring the white women, but they won't hire the colored women," documents how black women who migrated to Richmond found themselves confronting dual discrimination due to their race and gender. Employers and white employees engaged in discrimination that kept black women in low-wage and unskilled jobs. Managers justified not hiring black women by claiming that integrated workplaces would lead to strikes or slowdowns. White men generally didn't object to working alongside black men, but resisted promoting them. White women, however, cared intensely about maintaining social distance from black women and sometimes disrupted production rather than work with them. Because of this, employers typically kept black women out of jobs held by white women and segregated them into grueling, unpleasant, dirty work. Despite these barriers, approximately 600,000 African American women entered the industrial workforce during World War II. They left domestic service in massive numbers, The percentage of Black women working as domestic servants dropped from 59.9% in 1940 to 44.6% by war's end. The percentage employed in manufacturing doubled from 6.5% to 13%. But historian Karen Anderson emphasized that this progress came with a cost. The continuation of racial prejudice meant Black women remained concentrated in the worst jobs and were disproportionately laid off during reconversion. The discrimination extended to the military. The Women's Army Corps was segregated. Black WACs trained separately, lived in separate barracks, and were assigned to separate units. Many Black women didn't want to join because of this segregation, and those who did still faced discrimination. The Black press helped monitor and report on conditions for Black WACs, keeping pressure on the Army to treat them fairly. Charity Adams, one of only 2 Black WACs promoted to major during World War II, commanded the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion, an all-Black, all-female unit assigned to clear a massive backlog of mail for troops in Europe. Her unit performed brilliantly, sorting mail in half the expected time. Working 3 shifts around the clock, they averaged more than 65,000 pieces of mail sorted per 8-hour shift. Despite their excellence, they still faced discrimination and segregation. The Navy's waves initially refused to accept Black women entirely. Only in October 1944, with the war nearly over, did the Navy finally begin admitting a small number of Black women. By war's end, fewer than 100 Black women had served in waves. The Coast Guard spars accepted only 5 Black women during the entire war. 5. The Marine Corps Women's Reserve did not accept African American women at all during World War II. Neither did it accept Japanese American women. This discriminatory policy reflected the racism prevalent throughout American society and military institutions. Japanese American women faced a different kind of discrimination, incarceration. Following Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced removal and imprisonment of approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast. 2/3 were American citizens. Families were given days or weeks to sell their homes, businesses, and possessions before being shipped to concentration camps in remote desert and mountain locations. Women bore enormous burdens in the camps. When their husbands, typically the family breadwinners, were arrested and sent to camps first, women suddenly became responsible for financial and emotional support of their families with little warning. Japanese Americans were barred from jobs and denied access to banks, making it nearly impossible to support a family. Some women voluntarily imprisoned themselves and their children rather than be separated from their husbands. In the camps, Japanese American women faced harassment and abuse. Nina Wallace, writing in Densho, an online project preserving Japanese American internment experiences, recalled, women were often harassed, followed, threatened by white guards. At home, instances of domestic violence and sexual abuse were often audible in neighboring barracks and became common knowledge around the camp. Despite these horrific conditions, Japanese American women found ways to resist and survive. They worked as food servers, secretaries, and hospital staff, though for minimal pay. Some obtained college educations and became teachers, nurses, social workers, writers, and artists for camp newspapers. They challenged traditional cultural norms, sought jobs and educational opportunities, and kept morale up through weekly columns and support networks. Eventually, some Japanese American women were allowed to leave the camps to work in defense industries or serve in the military. A small number served as nurses, translators, medical technicians, and clerks in the United States military, joining from concentration camps, Hawaii, and throughout the country. Their service required extraordinary courage, serving a nation that had imprisoned their families. On April 3, 1946, 6 months after the war ended, the War Relocation Authority released Japanese Americans from the camps with no apology, a one-way train ticket, small amounts of money for some, and nothing more. Families had been torn apart. It took years for many women to reunite with their families. The trauma from forced relocation and imprisonment had lasting impacts on generations of Japanese Americans, especially women. Latina women and Native American women also worked in defense industries, though their experiences have been less documented than those of Black and Japanese American women. They too faced discrimination, lower wages, and harassment. They too had to fight for every opportunity. The irony was bitter and obvious. America was fighting a war against Nazi racism and Japanese militarism, claiming to defend democracy and freedom. Yet at home, American women of color faced systematic racism, segregation, and discrimination. Black women fought for a country that wouldn't let them use the same bathrooms as white women. Japanese American women served in the military while their families remained imprisoned in concentration camps. Many African American activists called this contradiction the WWII campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. They argued that America couldn't claim moral superiority over Nazi Germany while maintaining segregation and discrimination at home. Black women workers embodied this contradiction. They were told their work was essential to winning the war, but they were treated as second-class citizens unworthy of respect or equal treatment. Despite all these obstacles, women of color persevered. They took the jobs they could get. They endured the discrimination. They proved their capabilities again and again. They built the weapons that won the war, even when the country they were defending denied them basic dignity and equal rights. Their contribution was immense. The recognition they received was minimal. Last hired, first fired. Those 4 words captured the experience of hundreds of thousands of Black women who entered defense industries during World War II. They fought for opportunities that white women received freely. They endured discrimination that white women never faced. And when the war ended, they were pushed out first to make room for others. But they changed America anyway. They proved that the barriers keeping women of color out of good jobs were artificial and unjust. And they laid the groundwork for the civil rights struggles that would come in the decades ahead. Discrimination based on race wasn't the only challenge women faced in wartime workplaces. All women, regardless of race, confronted problems that made factory work far more difficult than it needed to be. Sexual harassment, the near total absence of childcare, unequal pay, long hours in dangerous conditions. These weren't minor inconveniences. They were serious obstacles that made women's already demanding work even harder. Sexual harassment in wartime factories was pervasive, though rarely discussed openly at the time. Women who worked alongside men faced constant verbal harassment, crude comments about their bodies, sexual propositions, lewd jokes and suggestions. Men would stare, make obscene gestures, touch women without permission, press against them inappropriately, or even masturbate in front of them. The severity of abuse ranged from verbal suggestions, threats, and insults to staring, touching, attempted rape, and rape. Some women were told explicitly that their job security depended on providing sexual favors. One woman working in a defense plant was told she would lose her job if she didn't have sex with her boss. This wasn't an isolated incident. Supervisors frequently traded better assignments for sex and punished those who refused with the worst jobs, the most dangerous tasks, and constant criticism designed to force them to quit. Women who complained about harassment faced retaliation. They were mocked, dismissed, threatened, and ostracized. Veteran female employees warned newcomers that reporting harassment brought only more trouble. The smallest infraction, routinely overlooked when committed by men, suddenly merited a write-up. The very nature of factory work, the pressure to keep the production line going, gave bosses power to inflict petty humiliations, such as denying bathroom breaks. At Ford plants in Chicago, women who complained were called snitch bitch or accused of raping the company. Many of the men who harassed them kept their jobs and continued the same behavior for decades. Some women felt doubly victimized, propositioned, and denounced as sluts while also being called racial slurs. The harassment crossed racial lines. Black, white, and Latino men all engaged in harassment. Black women suffered both sexual harassment and racial abuse simultaneously. The harassment had lasting effects. Women learned to keep quiet, to ignore the abuse, to try to blend in and avoid attracting attention. They developed strategies for surviving hostile work environments, walking in groups, avoiding being alone with male supervisors, dressing in loose clothing to hide their bodies, never bending over when men were nearby. But none of these strategies really worked. The harassment continued regardless. While sexual harassment made factory work miserable, the childcare crisis made it nearly impossible for mothers. In 1944, the female labor force peaked at 19 million workers. Many were mothers with young children. According to government guidelines, one childcare slot was required for every 10 female defense workers. That meant America needed approximately 1.9 million childcare spaces. How many existed? About 130,000. Less than 7% of what was needed. The numbers tell a devastating story. Only 3,000 childcare centers operated nationwide in 1944. 3,000 centers to serve millions of working mothers. The vast majority of women workers with children had absolutely no access to organized childcare. The childcare shortage created a crisis that the media called the latchkey children phenomenon. These were children who wore house keys on strings around their necks because they came home from school to empty houses. Their mothers were still at work. Younger children, too young for school, were left alone for hours while their mothers worked 8, 10, or 12-hour factory shifts. The popular media frequently reported on sleeping children found locked in cars and company parking lots while their mothers worked night shifts. One report from Oregon noted that women's absenteeism in shipyards was 4 to 5 times greater than that of men, due in large part to the breakdown of plans for care of their children. Women missed work when their children got sick, when childcare arrangements fell through, when school was closed. They had no choice. But employers penalized them for these absences, threatening termination if attendance didn't improve. The federal government response was slow and inadequate. Congress passed the Lanham Act in 1941, intended to create community facilities in war-impact areas. But it wasn't until 1943, 2 years into America's involvement in the war, that Congress interpreted the Lanham Act as authorizing support for childcare. Congress allocated $6 million to convert the remaining emergency nursery schools from the Depression into childcare facilities. The Lanham Act childcare program eventually funded centers in war production areas. The centers offered high-quality care with trained staff, nutritious meals, activities, and educational programs. Parents paid an average of 50 to 75 cents per child per day, affordable for most working women. For the families who had access to these centers, they provided welcome relief from worry about their children's well-being. But the program was late to start, limited in scope, and incapable of greatly increasing women's employment in the aggregate. Childcare facilities were funded more in places that already had higher participation rates of mothers and where wartime need was greatest. The organization of new services bogged down in interagency competition at the federal level and in considerable red tape when local communities applied for federal funding. While California spent an average of $264 per child, New Mexico spent $0. The program varied wildly by state. Public opinion remained hostile to both maternal employment and childcare. Many Americans believed mothers belonged at home with their children. Children's experts warned that children in group care might suffer the effects of maternal deprivation. Media stories about latchkey children serve to castigate selfish wage-earning mothers rather than point up the need for childcare. The government itself initially claimed that mothers who remain at home are performing an essential patriotic service, discouraging maternal employment even as factories desperately needed workers. The childcare shortage forced women to make impossible choices. Some worked night shifts so they could be home during the day while their children were awake. Others arranged split shifts with husbands or relatives, creating round-the-clock childcare through family coordination. Many relied on older children, sometimes as young as 10 or 12 years old, to care for younger siblings. Others left children with neighbors, relatives, or anyone who would watch them. Some simply brought children to work and hoped supervisors wouldn't notice. The stress was enormous. Women worried constantly about their children. They worked exhausting shifts, then came home to full responsibility for cooking, cleaning, and childcare with no partner to share the burden. Sleep deprivation became chronic. Many women operated on 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night for years. The physical and emotional toll was crushing. And all of this, the harassment, the childcare crisis, the exhaustion, was compounded by another injustice: unequal pay. Despite doing the same work as men, women earned significantly less. A female worker rarely earned more than 50% of male wages. In some industries, the gap was even worse. Women doing identical jobs to men, operating the same machinery, meeting the same production quotas, took home paychecks that were half the size. The wage gap persisted throughout the war despite some efforts to address it. At unionized workplaces like Kaiser Shipyards and Willow Run, women received equal pay thanks to union contracts that mandated equal pay for equal work. But most defense plants weren't unionized or ignored equal pay provisions. Employers justified lower pay by claiming women were less skilled, less productive, or didn't need to support families. All of these justifications were false, but they persisted. Women's unions tried to fight for equal pay. At Rolls-Royce plants in Scotland, women objected to being paid at a lower rate than unskilled men doing the same work. American women filed complaints with the War Labor Board demanding equal pay. Some won their cases. Most didn't. The War Labor Board lacked enforcement power, and employers simply ignored its rulings. The National War Labor Board issued General Order No. 16 in 1942, establishing equal pay for equal work as official policy. But equal work was narrowly defined. If employers could claim that jobs performed by women differed even slightly from jobs performed by men, different job titles, different shifts, slightly different tasks, they could legally pay women less. And most employers took full advantage of this loophole. Research by economists Darren Acemoglu, David Otter, and David Lyle found that increases in female labor supply during World War II actually decreased both female and male wages, but had a stronger effect on women's wages. Women's entry into the workforce in massive numbers put downward pressure on wages generally. But because women were concentrated in certain job categories and faced discrimination, their wages suffered more than men's. By 1950, 5 years after the war ended, women working full-time year-round earned approximately 60% of what men earned. The war had narrowed the gap slightly. Before the war, women earned about 50% of male wages. But progress was minimal, and the gap would remain stubbornly persistent for decades. Even today, women earn less than men for comparable work, though the gap has narrowed. The combination of sexual harassment, childcare crisis, and unequal pay meant that women workers during World War II operated under conditions far more difficult than those faced by male workers. Men didn't worry about being sexually propositioned by supervisors. Men didn't struggle to find childcare because society expected their wives to handle that responsibility. Men earned full wages that could support a family. Women had to work twice as hard for half the pay while also managing households, raising children, and enduring constant harassment. They did it anyway. They showed up to factories and shipyards day after day despite the obstacles. They proved their dedication and their resilience. But the cost was high in stress, exhaustion, and the knowledge that no matter how well they performed, they would never receive the recognition or compensation they deserved. These struggles, harassment, childcare, unequal pay, were minor footnotes to the story of Rosie the Riveter. They were central to the experience of millions of women workers. Understanding these challenges makes women's accomplishments during the war even more remarkable. They built the arsenal of democracy despite facing obstacles that would have broken many people. They persevered because they had to, because their families needed the income, because the war effort depended on them. And when the war ended, many of these problems didn't disappear. They persisted for decades. Sexual harassment remained common in workplaces. Affordable childcare remained scarce. The wage gap endured. The women who worked during World War II helped expose these injustices, but solving them would require generations of continued struggle. 1944, the year everything came together. The year American industrial production reached its absolute peak. The year women's employment hit its highest point. The year the weapons women built finally turned the tide of the war decisively in favor of the Allies. By 1944, more than 18 million American women were working, with more than 14.3 million employed in war-related industries. 1 out of every 4 married women held jobs. 37% of all women worked outside the home, a figure that wouldn't be matched again until the 1970s. The production statistics from 1944 are almost impossible to comprehend. By that year, America was producing 2/3 of all Allied military equipment used in the war. 2/3. American factories were outproducing Britain, the Soviet Union, Canada, and all other Allied nations combined. The numbers tell the story. American industry produced almost 300,000 military and special-purpose aircraft during the war, with production peaking in 1944. 87,000 tanks, 72,000 naval vessels, 4,900 merchant ships, 193,000 artillery pieces, 2 million trucks, millions of rifles, machine guns, and pistols, billions of rounds of ammunition. More than 50% of the labor force in manufacturing, mining, and construction sectors worked on military contracts by 1944. Think about that. Half of all industrial workers were building weapons and supplies for the war effort. And a huge percentage of those workers were women. Manufacturing output had exploded since 1939. Aircraft production increased by over 800%. Shipbuilding increased by over 5,000%. Ammunition production grew exponentially. Industries that barely existed before the war became massive operations employing hundreds of thousands of workers. And women made it possible. Women operated the machines. Women assembled the components. Women inspected the finished products. The geographic concentration of female war work was astounding. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, home to converted military vehicle plants, more women were working in war production by summer 1944 than were employed in any job in 1940. The entire female workforce of some cities had been mobilized for war production. Every available woman was working. In Southern California, the heart of aircraft manufacturing, hundreds of thousands of women built the bombers and fighters that were winning air superiority over Europe and the Pacific. In Richmond, California, women comprised 1/3 of Kaiser Shipyard's 90,000 workers, building Liberty ships at a rate that stunned the world. In Mobile, Alabama, women built tankers and destroyers that were defeating German U-boats and Japanese warships. Across the country, in cities large and small, women were transforming raw materials into the weapons of victory. And then came June 6, 1944, D-Day, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, the largest amphibious assault in human history. 156,000 Allied troops stormed 5 beaches on the coast of France, supported by more than 5,000 ships and 13,000 aircraft. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Every weapon used in that invasion was built by American, British, and Canadian workers. The ships that carried troops across the English Channel, many were Liberty ships built by women welders at Kaiser shipyards and other American yards. The landing craft that delivered soldiers onto the beaches, women assembled them. The aircraft that bombed German positions and provided air cover, women riveted the fuselages, installed the engines, and wired the electrical systems. The trucks and jeeps that rolled off those landing craft, women built them in converted automobile plants. The rifles soldiers carried, the machine guns they fired, the artillery that supported them, the ammunition they used, all of it came from factories where women worked. Thelma Snyder, who worked as a factory worker during the war, said it simply, "I believe the war would not have been won without the help of millions of women on the home front." Historians agree. Without women's labor, the arsenal of democracy would have produced a fraction of what it did. The D-Day invasion would have been impossible. The defeat of Nazi Germany would have taken years longer and cost hundreds of thousands more lives. Jessica Weiss, a professor of history at Cal State East Bay, emphasized this point. The war effort on the home front was a women's effort. Despite the fact that women were first fired after the war, you never really saw a step down in women's employment again. The women who built the weapons for D-Day changed American society permanently. By July 1944, total female employment reached its highest point of the war, more than 14.3 million women in war-related industries. This represented roughly 6.7 million additional women who had entered the workforce since 1940, an increase of almost 50% in just 4 years. Manufacturing alone employed more than 3 million additional women compared to 1940, rising from 21% to 34% of total female employment. The production miracle of 1944 wasn't just about quantity. It was about quality and efficiency. American workers, led by women in many industries, had learned their jobs, mastered their skills, and become incredibly productive. The B-24 Liberator that took months to build in 1942 was rolling off assembly lines every 63 minutes by 1944. Ships that took 130 days to build in 1941 were being completed in 42 days. Quality improved too. Defect rates dropped. Aircraft performance exceeded specifications. Ships proved seaworthy and durable. Letters from soldiers overseas reached factory workers, thanking them for the quality of their work. Pilots wrote praising the aircraft that brought them home safely. Sailors thanked shipyard workers for vessels that survived storms and enemy attacks. Tank crews expressed gratitude for machines that protected them in combat. These letters meant everything to women workers. They proved that their work mattered. They confirmed that the long hours, the exhaustion, the sacrifices were worth it. The weapons women built didn't just support D-Day. They enabled every major Allied operation of 1944. In the Pacific, American forces island-hopped toward Japan, supported by ships, aircraft, and equipment women had manufactured. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of the war, built partially by women workers, began bombing Japan in June 1944. In Italy, Allied forces pushed north toward Rome, supplied by American trucks, weapons, and ammunition. In the Soviet Union, American Lend-Lease equipment, including trucks, aircraft, and supplies, helped the Red Army drive German forces back toward Poland. By late 1944, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Germany and Japan were losing. Allied forces were advancing on all fronts. The massive production advantage that American industry, powered largely by women workers, had created proved decisive. Germany couldn't replace its losses. Japan couldn't match American production. The arsenal of democracy was overwhelming the Axis powers through sheer volume of weapons and equipment. Roughly 60% of all the combat munitions used by Allies in 1944 were produced in the United States. 60%. American factories supplied not just American forces, but British, Soviet, Chinese, and other Allied armies. The United States had become the world's factory, and women were the workforce that made it possible. The turning point of 1944, the moment when Allied victory became inevitable, was built on the backs of women who learned to rivet, weld, assemble, and inspect. Women who worked 54-hour weeks, who juggled childcare and factory shifts, who endured harassment and discrimination, who proved day after day that they could do the job. Women didn't just contribute to winning World War II. They were essential to it. Without their labor, the invasion of Normandy couldn't have happened. Without their skills, American forces couldn't have defeated Germany and Japan. Without their determination, the arsenal of democracy would have remained a dream rather than becoming reality. The victory built in 1944 belonged to everyone: soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. But it also belonged to the millions of women who never fired a shot, never saw combat, never wore a uniform. Women who instead wore coveralls, safety glasses, and steel-toed shoes. Women who operated drill presses and welding torches. Women who built the ships that carried troops to Normandy, the aircraft that bombed Berlin, the tanks that liberated France. This was their victory too. The women who answered their country's call. The women who proved they could do the impossible. The women who changed America forever while they changed the course of history. Then came August 14th, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. VJ Day. The war was over. Americans celebrated in the streets. Sailors kissed nurses in Times Square. Church bells rang. Fireworks exploded. The greatest war in human history had ended with Allied victory. But for millions of American women workers, the celebration was short-lived. The message they received was blunt and unambiguous. Your job belongs to a man now. Go home. The reconversion, the transition from wartime production to peacetime economy, hit women workers like a sledgehammer. Within months of the war ending, millions of women were laid off from their factory jobs. In some plants, women workers arrived for their shifts and found the gates locked with notices posted: facility closing, all workers terminated. Others received pink slips with just days of notice. Some were simply told one day not to come back the next. The statistics tell a brutal story. Between 1945 and 1946, the female industrial workforce collapsed. Women disappeared from industrial employment at rates far exceeding men. In manufacturing alone, more than 3 million women lost their jobs as defense plants shut down or converted back to civilian production. Women who had made up 34% of manufacturing workers in 1944 found themselves pushed out systematically. Black women were hit hardest. Last hired, first fired, Karen Anderson's phrase proved tragically accurate during reconversion. African American women who had fought their way into industrial jobs found themselves dismissed before white women, who were dismissed before white men. The few gains Black women had made during the war evaporated almost overnight. Within months, the percentage of Black women working in manufacturing plummeted. Many found themselves forced back into domestic service, the very jobs they had escaped during the war. The layoffs weren't random or economically necessary. Yes, defense production was winding down. Yes, factories were closing or retooling. But employers and labor unions worked together to ensure that men, particularly returning veterans, got preference for the jobs that remained. The 1940 Selective Training and Service Act gave returning servicemen who had quit their jobs to serve the right to demand those jobs back within 40 days of discharge. That alone gave 4 million returning servicemen priority over women workers. The United States Employment Service, which operated government job placement offices, gave priority to veterans as soon as the war ended. The federal government itself laid off more than half of its female employees, from a peak of 1.1 million down to less than 500,000 by 1947. Private industry followed suit. Companies that had begged women to take factory jobs during the war now couldn't get rid of them fast enough. Surveys conducted before the war ended revealed that most women wanted to keep working. About 75% of wartime employed women in surveyed areas expected to remain in the labor force after the war. These weren't women planning to quit. They wanted to continue working. They needed the income. They had proven their capabilities. They wanted careers, not just temporary wartime service. But what women wanted didn't matter. Employers, unions, government officials, and society generally agreed. Women's place was in the home, not the factory. The propaganda machine that had glorified Rosie the Riveter during the war reversed itself instantly. Now magazines, newspapers, and radio programs celebrated the housewife and mother. Women who continued working were portrayed as selfish, as taking jobs from men who needed to support families. Some women left voluntarily. They were exhausted from years of grueling factory work. They wanted to start families or care for children they had barely seen during the war. Their husbands had returned from combat, found jobs, and could support the household. These women gladly returned to domestic life, relieved that the war was over and their families could be together again. But many, perhaps most, didn't leave voluntarily. They were fired. They were laid off. They were displaced by men. And the jobs available to them after being laid off paid far less than their wartime factory work. A woman who had earned $30 per week as a riveter found herself offered jobs as a waitress or store clerk for $12 per week. Of course, she didn't take those jobs. But when she didn't, she was accused of not really wanting to work. Women who protested the layoffs found little support. Unions that had accepted women members during the war now prioritized male workers. Some unions actively campaigned to remove women from industrial jobs. The United Auto Workers, which had organized many women workers during the war, negotiated contracts that gave preference to male employees during layoffs. Women's seniority, earned through years of wartime service, meant nothing when veterans needed jobs. Despite the massive layoffs, something remarkable happened. Women didn't give up on working. They looked for new jobs. They sought employment in different industries. They took clerical positions, retail jobs, teaching positions, nursing roles. By 1950, the number of women employed in the United States had once again reached wartime highs, though they were working in different occupations. Women had permanently entered the workforce, even if they'd been pushed out of manufacturing. But here's what the men who fired women workers didn't understand. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't show millions of women what they're capable of achieving and then expect them to forget it. You can't let women prove they can operate complex machinery, manage technical tasks, earn good wages, and contribute meaningfully to society, and then tell them their only value is as housewives and mothers. The women who worked during World War II had learned something that couldn't be unlearned. They had discovered their own strength. The women who were laid off from defense plants didn't give up on working. They found other jobs. By 1950, female labor force participation had rebounded to wartime levels, though women were working in different occupations. The pattern of working until marriage and then quitting forever, that old pattern was broken. Married women continued working in unprecedented numbers. Women with children sought employment. The assumption that women's place was exclusively in the home had been permanently shattered. The economic impact was profound. Women who worked during the war earned money, sometimes for the first time in their lives. They managed budgets. They made financial decisions. They gained confidence in their ability to support themselves and their families. That confidence didn't disappear when the war ended. Women had tasted economic independence, and they wanted more of it. Many refused to return to complete financial dependence on husbands or fathers. The savings women accumulated during the war years fueled the prosperity of the 1950s. Women had bought war bonds, opened savings accounts, and put money away because consumer goods were scarce during the war. When the war ended, that money helped families buy homes in the new suburbs springing up around American cities. It helped finance the post-war economic boom. Women's wartime earnings literally built the foundation for the prosperity millions of American families enjoyed in the 1950s. The cultural shift was even more important than the economic one. Before the war, society believed women were inherently unsuited for technical, physically demanding, or intellectually challenging work. Women were supposed to be delicate, emotional, and incapable of handling machinery, mathematics, or complex problem-solving. The war proved all of that was nonsense. Women operated the same machinery as men. They read the same blueprints. They met the same production quotas. They performed the same jobs. The only difference was the paycheck, and even that injustice highlighted the absurdity of claiming women couldn't do the work. A generation of girls grew up during the war watching their mothers, aunts, and older sisters work in factories and shipyards. They saw women in uniform. They saw women flying airplanes. They saw women doing jobs that society had always said were impossible for women. Those girls learned that women's capabilities weren't limited by biology or nature. They were limited only by discrimination and prejudice. That lesson would fuel the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s. The women's movement that emerged in the 1960s didn't come from nowhere. It had roots in the wartime experience of millions of women who had proven themselves capable and then been told to go home. Betty Friedan's landmark book, The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, resonated with millions of women precisely because many of them remembered working during the war. They remembered earning their own money, having their own identities beyond wife and mother, feeling the satisfaction of meaningful work. And they wanted that back. Historians and social scientists agree that World War II shifted the boundaries of acceptable work for women in the post-war years. Women's wartime work didn't just temporarily increase female employment. It permanently changed what kinds of jobs women could hold, what kinds of careers they could pursue, what kinds of lives they could imagine for themselves. As one scholar noted, women appropriated, transformed, and challenged the domestic stereotype constructed after World War II. The war effort to bring women to work produced a change in home dynamics that would forever change women. The long-term legacy is clear in the statistics. From the 1950s onward, women's labor force participation increased steadily for decades. Married women entered the workforce in growing numbers. Women with young children sought employment. By the 1980s, over 50% of American women worked outside the home. By the early 21st century, that figure approached 70%. None of that would have been possible without the wartime experience that proved women could work, wanted to work, and deserved to work. Rosie the Riveter became more than a wartime propaganda symbol. She became a feminist icon, a symbol of women's strength, capability, and determination. The "We Can Do It" poster, barely known during the war itself, became one of the most recognizable images in American culture. It appeared on T-shirts, coffee mugs, posters, and protest signs. It represented the idea that women could do anything men could do if given the opportunity and the training. Real-life Rosies, the women who actually worked in defense plants during the war, became honored and celebrated in their old age. Museums created exhibits about their contributions. Documentaries told their stories. Communities held ceremonies recognizing their service. Finally, decades after the war ended, these women received the acknowledgement they deserved. And their message to younger generations of women was consistent. We proved it could be done. We proved women were capable. We changed what was possible for you. The 6 million American women who joined epic factories to win World War II didn't just build weapons. They built a foundation for all the progress that would follow. They proved that the limitations placed on women were artificial. They demonstrated that women's potential was vast and untapped. They showed that when given the opportunity, women could achieve anything. And that lesson, that fundamental truth, became the seed from which grew the women's liberation movement, the fight for equal rights, and the ongoing struggle for true gender equality. So why did they do it? Why did 6 million American women join epic factories to win World War II? After exploring their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs, we can finally answer that question. And the answer is both simple and profound. They did it out of patriotism. When their country faced an existential threat, when Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan threatened to destroy democracy and freedom, American women responded. They understood that every aircraft they riveted, every ship they welded, every weapon they assembled was going to soldiers fighting overseas. Many of those soldiers were their husbands, sons, brothers, and fathers. Women worked because they believed they were serving their country just as surely as any soldier in uniform. My husband is fighting, I can too. That sentiment motivated millions of women to take factory jobs. They did it out of economic necessity. For working-class women, women of color, and single mothers, defense industry jobs offered wages they'd never imagined earning. A Black woman who had made $10 per week as a domestic servant could earn $30 per week riveting aircraft. That money meant food on the table, rent paid on time, and perhaps even savings for the future. Economic opportunity wasn't secondary to patriotism, it was equally important. Women needed those jobs to survive and support their families. They did it because they were given an opportunity. Before the war, society told women they couldn't operate complex machinery, couldn't handle physically demanding work, couldn't master technical skills. The war proved all of that wrong. When women were given training, support, and the chance to prove themselves, they excelled. They discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed. They learned they could weld steel, rivet aircraft, build ships, and perform any job men could do. That discovery was transformative. They did it out of courage. Factory work was dangerous. Women were injured, disabled, and killed in industrial accidents. They faced sexual harassment, discrimination, and hostility from male coworkers and supervisors. They juggled exhausting work schedules with childcare responsibilities and household duties. They endured chronic sleep deprivation and physical exhaustion. They persevered despite all these obstacles because they were tougher than anyone, including themselves, had realized. They did it because they had no choice. When the government and defense contractors recruited women aggressively, when propaganda campaigns told them their country needed them, when husbands went overseas to fight leaving families without income, women responded. Many didn't feel they had the luxury of saying no. Their families needed the money. Their country needed the labor. They stepped up because circumstances demanded it. The answer to why 6 million women joined epic factories isn't just one reason, it's all these reasons combined. Patriotism, economic necessity, opportunity, courage, and circumstance all played roles. Different women had different primary motivations, but what united them all was a willingness to do something unprecedented. They walked through factory gates into a world that had always excluded them. They learned skills society said they couldn't master. They worked jobs everyone claimed they couldn't handle. And they proved that women's potential was limitless when given the chance. These women built 300,000 aircraft, thousands of ships, millions of weapons, and billions of rounds of ammunition. They supplied 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. They made the D-Day invasion possible. They helped defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. They won World War II. Not alone, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who fought the battles deserve immense credit. But without the women who built the weapons, victory would have been impossible. And beyond winning the war, they changed America forever. They proved that women belonged in the workforce. They demonstrated that women's capabilities extended far beyond traditional domestic roles. They laid the foundation for the women's liberation movement, the fight for equal rights, and every advancement women have made in the decades since. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a wartime propaganda symbol. She represented real women, 6 million real women, who answered their country's call in its darkest hour. Women who worked despite exhaustion, discrimination, and danger. Women who saved the money that built post-war prosperity. Women who inspired their daughters and granddaughters to reach for opportunities that wouldn't have existed without their sacrifice. So why did 6 million American women join epic factories to win World War II? Because they could. Because they had to. Because they chose to. Because when their nation faced an existential crisis, they stepped forward with courage, determination, and an unshakable belief that they could make a difference. And they were right. They did make a difference. They made all the difference. Their legacy lives on in every woman who pursues a career, who demands equal pay, who refuses to accept artificial limitations on her potential. The 6 million women who became Rosie the Riveter changed the course of history. They won the war. They transformed American society. And they proved, once and for all, that we can do it.